Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It started with something small. A pen. Not just any pen, but the one I always used for writing notes. It was my favorite, black ink with a silver clip that shone in the light. I had placed it on the kitchen counter that morning after jotting down a quick grocery list, but when I came back to check it later that afternoon, it was gone. I searched everywhere. The counter, the drawers, the kitchen sink, even the floor, as if it could have rolled away somehow. But there was no pen. At first, I thought it was just me being forgetful, but this was different. I was sure I hadn't moved it. Maybe I left it somewhere else? I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was meticulous about where I placed things. I always had been. A few days passed, and I didn't think about it much. After all, it was just a pen. But then the small things began to vanish. A hair tie. A spoon. A key I swore I had just put on the entryway table. Little objects that didn't make a difference at first but began to add up. Every time I realized something was missing, I could feel a creeping sense of unease. Was I losing my mind? Or was something more unsettling happening? I didn't tell anyone. I brushed it off. Surely, there was a rational explanation. But then the sound started. It was subtle at first, just a faint shuffling sound from the hallway. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was the old pipes or the wind outside, but it happened every night. That soft shuffle, as if something or someone was moving in the dark. At night, I would lie awake in bed, listening to the silence. Only, it wasn't really silent. I could hear the shuffling, always coming from the hallway. It wasn't a random noise. It felt intentional, and the hairs on the back of my neck would rise. I moved around the apartment, checking every corner, every shadow. But there was never anything there. No one. No explanation. Just the sound. Then one evening, after I had come back from a short errand, I saw it. A shadow in the hallway. It was fleeting, just a glimpse, but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual darkness that settled in the apartment at night. No, this was something different. Something watching. I froze, my heart racing. I thought I must have imagined it. But then I heard the shuffle again. Closer this time. It was real. And whatever it wasn't just taking my things. It was watching me. I could feel it now, even in broad daylight. I should have left. But where would I go? This place, this apartment, was all I had left. And I couldn't shake the feeling that wherever I went, this thing would follow. The days blurred together. I couldn't tell if it was the unease or something else that was making me lose track of time. Every morning, I'd wake up and check the house, as if expecting something more to be gone. But things weren't disappearing as quickly anymore. Instead, I felt something else, a shift. A presence. The shuffling noise had gotten louder. It was more than just a soft shuffle now. It was unmistakable, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the hardwood floors in the hallway. They didn't belong to me. They didn't belong to anyone I knew. I started keeping the lights on. It didn't help much, though. The lights flickered, just enough to remind me that something wasn't right. I could hear the creak of floorboards even when there was no one there. And at night, the shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to stretch a little longer, a little more defined, as if they were waiting for me to notice them. The unease was becoming unbearable. I felt like I was being pulled between the world I knew and something else, something darker. I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house felt like it was closing in on me. And when I would finally close my eyes, I would see flashes of dark figures. Shapes that moved too fast to identify. I moved the furniture around. Maybe it was the layout of the apartment. Maybe it was making the atmosphere feel claustrophobic. I even started locking doors that didn't need to be locked. The feeling of being watched was too intense. Then it happened again. A larger object went missing this time. My favorite book. It was a small, leather-bound journal I had inherited from my grandmother. I had kept it on the coffee table, the only possession I truly valued. When I returned home that evening, it was gone. I searched frantically. I checked the same spots, the same places where things had disappeared before. No trace of the journal. I couldn't understand how something so important could vanish without a trace. That night, I felt the presence again. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned off the lights and stayed in the dark, hoping the silence would somehow protect me. But the silence was broken. The shuffle, closer this time, was accompanied by something else, a low hum. It wasn't a sound I could place, like a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere. It grew louder and more persistent. The floor beneath me vibrated slightly, as though something heavy was moving just beyond my line of sight. And then, for the first time, I saw it. A shadow appeared in the doorway of my bedroom. It was darker than the night itself, a shape that was too tall, too unnatural. It stood still for a moment, and then, as if it knew I had seen it, it moved fast, like a blur. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the footsteps, now louder than ever, echoing through the apartment. They circled the room, moving with purpose, as if they were searching for something. Or perhaps, for me. I felt a chill in the air, the kind that creeps deep into your bones. I grabbed my phone and dialed the first number I could think of. I didn't care who answered, I just needed someone to be there. To help me. But the phone, it didn't work. The call didn't go through. It felt like the apartment itself was swallowing up the sound. And then the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I looked around, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just the empty, cold air. And then, as if on cue, something else moved. The journal. The one that had vanished earlier. It appeared on the floor in front of me, as if it had always been there. The pages fluttered open, revealing a note scrawled hastily across the first page. Leave. The word was clear. It was a warning. And it wasn't the first time I had been warned. I stared at the note, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The journal, the one that had been missing, now lay before me as if it had never left. I couldn't make sense of it. How could it have just appeared? How could I not have noticed it, especially after all the frantic searching? The word leave seemed to echo in the room, a sharp, guttural whisper that I couldn't ignore. I ran my fingers over the paper, the ink smudged in places, as if it had been written in a rush, in panic. The air around me grew cold again, almost suffocating. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This wasn't just some twisted coincidence. Whatever was happening, whatever had been taking my things, whatever had been watching me, it was real. The phone still didn't work. The signal was completely gone. In that moment, the apartment felt like a prison. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now seemed to close in around me. I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. But where would I go? Every corner of the apartment felt like it was tainted, every shadow hiding something I couldn't explain. The hallway, the kitchen, even the bathroom, nothing felt safe. The thought of leaving crossed my mind more than once, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I left, the thing following me would simply find me again. Would it let me go, even if I tried to run? Or was there something in this place, something connected to the very walls, that would never let me escape? The sound came again. The shuffle. But this time it wasn't just in the hallway. It was inside the room with me, close, too close. My heart hammered in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, but they weren't moving away, they were coming toward me. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the room. There was nothing except the dark corners where the shadows seemed to thicken. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, a cloud of vapor rising from my lips. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe, twisting like living things. I could feel them, pressing in on me. I took a step back, my body instinctively moving away from the darkness, but there was nowhere to go. My back hit the wall, and the air around me felt heavy, thick with dread. And then I saw it again, the shadow in the doorway. It wasn't just a shape this time. It had form. It was taller, its outline more defined, like a silhouette of a person, but there was something wrong with it. The darkness seemed to shift and bend around it, as though it were a part of the night itself, a void that stretched beyond the physical realm. I couldn't move. My body froze in terror. It stepped closer, and I could feel its presence, like a cold hand pressing against my chest. And then I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur, but it grew louder with each breath I took. Leave. It was the same word from the journal, but now it wasn't just a warning. It was a command. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the air around me was thick with some invisible force, trapping me in place. My mind screamed for escape, but my body betrayed me. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting, stretching in unnatural ways. It reached out, a dark, inhuman hand that seemed to dissolve into the air before it even touched anything. It didn't need to touch me. I felt the pressure, the weight of it, pressing into my very soul. I could feel the panic rising, my heartbeat erratic and wild. What was this? What was happening to me? What was this thing that haunted my every step? The voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent. Leave, or it will take you too. The threat was unmistakable. It was then that I realized the truth. This was no longer just about disappearing objects. No longer about strange noises or fleeting shadows. This thing, this presence, had been waiting for me. It had been drawing me in slowly, quietly, until now. And now it wanted me to leave, or face the consequences. I didn't know what it was. But I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't leave soon, I might not ever get the chance to. The shadow loomed over me, its cold embrace suffocating, and I knew that I had run out of time. The chill in the room deepened, so cold it felt like my skin might crack under the pressure. The shadow moved again, closer now, closer than I could stand. I could hear the faintest rustling, like the softest whisper of fabric. I wasn't sure if it was the shadow itself, or something within me, but I could feel the unmistakable weight of something dark, something ancient, pressing down on me. "Leave," the voice demanded again. It was deeper this time, a low growl that vibrated in my bones. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms as I struggled to breathe. I tried to think, to clear my mind, but everything was clouded by that constant, suffocating fear. I couldn't think of any logical explanation. There was no rational way to explain the vanishing objects, the eerie footsteps, the oppressive shadows. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more impossible it seemed. It wasn't just my imagination. It was real. Whatever was happening here was real, and I was at its mercy. But then, something shifted inside me. A small, fragile thought poked through the terror. I had to leave. It didn't matter if I didn't understand. It didn't matter if I couldn't explain it. I had to go. There was nothing left for me in this place. Whatever it was that had been haunting me, whatever it had been slowly building, I could feel it growing stronger. If I didn't leave now, I wasn't sure I ever would. The shadow stood still for a moment, as though it was waiting for me to act. I could feel its presence, heavy, suffocating, as if it was daring me to make a move. But as I took a step forward, something stopped me. A sudden, sharp noise, like a door slamming shut, echoed through the apartment. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway was now completely dark, the door at the end of it hanging open just slightly. The same place where the shadows had always come from. I had seen that door before. It had always been closed. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever might be lurking there. But I had no choice. I had to move, to escape, to run as far as I could. I forced my legs to move, each step heavier than the last. As I neared the door, my eyes were drawn to the floor. A trail of dark marks, thick and wet, seemed to lead from the doorway to the center of the room. It wasn't just dirt, it was something else, something wrong. The ground beneath it looked disturbed, as though something had been dragging across it. The marks led me forward, and as I passed the doorway, I could feel the temperature drop even more. My breath came out in sharp clouds, visible in the dim light. Then I saw it, on the other side of the door. A mirror. I hadn't seen it there before. It wasn't part of the room's usual layout. It was tall, framed in dark wood, its surface perfectly still and unmarked. But it wasn't just the mirror that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in it. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was me. But it wasn't. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. The woman staring back at me was hollow. Her eyes were dark and empty, her face pale as death. She looked like she had been waiting for me, like she had been drawn to this moment, just like I had. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body frozen in place as the reflection in the mirror began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand. And then it smiled. A wide, unnaturally wide smile. Its lips stretched too far, its teeth sharp and crooked, a grin that could never belong to anyone human. I backed away, panic rising in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was alive. It moved with intent, its smile widening as it took a step toward me. The distance between us seemed to vanish with each movement. I turned to run, but the air was thick, heavier than it had been before. The door, my only escape, slammed shut with a deafening crash. I felt my pulse in my ears, my thoughts chaotic, my limbs stiff with fear. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The pen. The same one that had disappeared days ago. It lay on the floor, in the middle of the room, like it had always been there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly in my hand, the metal cool against my skin. And that's when I realized the object wasn't just lost. It had been placed. Deliberately. It was part of the pattern. Part of the game. This thing, whatever it was toying with me. And I was trapped. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the whisper. Leave, or stay, forever. The world around me blurred as the darkness took hold. The oppressive weight of the air pressed against my chest, and my legs buckled under me, my body collapsing to the floor. I could feel the cold beneath me, the chill of the hardwood seeping through my clothes, but it wasn't the floor that was cold, it was everything. My very bones felt frozen. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as though every thought I had, every memory, was being pulled from me, sucked into the dark void that surrounded me. The whispering voices, the one I had heard for days, the one that had told me to leave, were no longer just whispers. They were all around me, growing louder, merging into one deep, hollow sound. A chant. Leave. Stay. Leave. Stay. Leave. It wasn't even a voice anymore. It was like the very walls of the apartment were speaking to me. The air vibrated with the command, the weight of it suffocating. I couldn't escape it. I tried to stand, to break free, but the shadows around me were thick, too thick. They twisted and writhed like living things, wrapping themselves around my body, tugging at me, pulling me back into the darkness. I could feel them pressing into my skin, their cold, clammy fingers crawling over my arms, my neck. I could still hear it, the pen. The faint scratch of it against the floor, as if something unseen were moving it, shifting it, dragging it closer to me. The mirror. I could still see its reflection, not in the room, but in my mind. That smile. That horrible, twisted smile, its eyes full of hollow darkness. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was me. A part of me knew I had to do. The thing in the apartment, the thing that had been tormenting me, wasn't just trying to drive me mad, it was trying to replace me. It had been erasing me from the world, piece by piece, taking my belongings, my memories, my sense of self. I had seen the reflection in the mirror. That woman, who wasn't me, was the one that would take my place. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to fall, to give in. But I wasn't going to let it. I couldn't. I forced myself to stand. The shadows, the cold, the whispering, they all fought against me, but I fought harder. With every step, I felt the darkness retreat just a little more, the weight lifting from my chest. I reached for the pen again, gripping it tightly in my hand. The metal was warm now, pulsing with energy, as if it were alive, as if it were a part of me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. There were no instructions, no guide, but I knew it was my last hope. Leave, the whisper came again, but now I was more desperate, more frantic, like it could feel me resisting, like it was losing control. The shadows began to recede, pulling away from me as if they feared what I might do. I turned and ran toward the door. It was still closed, locked, but I didn't hesitate. I slammed my body against it, feeling the cold metal of the doorknob in my hand, the pressure building behind my ribs as I twisted it with all my strength. The door groaned and buckled as if it were alive, and with one final push, it broke free. The world outside was disorienting at first. It was daylight. I had forgotten what the sun felt like. But the air felt different now, lighter, as though a heavy fog had lifted. I was outside. I was free. But I wasn't safe. The apartment stood before me, the window of the room where I had just been staring back at me. It seemed so ordinary from the outside, so normal. But I knew better. I knew that whatever had been in there, whatever had followed me, was still inside, still waiting for someone else to walk through that door. The question lingered. I had escaped, yes. But had I really? The pen, the journal, the mirror, the shadows. I knew they weren't just gone. They were still tied to that place. And now, I had left a piece of myself behind. I took a deep breath and walked away. But as I stepped further down the street, something caught my eye. A figure in the distance, standing at the window of the apartment. The same figure, the same face, hollow, twisted, smiling. And that smile, it was mine. I turned, almost instinctively, but there was nothing behind me, no one in the window anymore. I wasn't sure if I had escaped after all. But one thing was certain, whatever had been in that apartment, whatever had haunted me, had found a way to follow. It was still watching. And it would always be waiting. Have you ever seen something that didn't belong, something so out of place that it made you question everything around it? Imagine walking down a street you know so well, a street you've walked 1,000 times, and seeing something that feels like it wasn't meant to be there, like it just appeared from nowhere. That's how I felt when I saw the sign. I hadn't been to that part of town in years. Too many memories there, too much history. And yet, as I turned the corner, I saw it, the cafe I used to visit all the time when I was younger. The faded, chipped sign hanging above the door, barely visible from the street, still reading Maggie's Cafe. I hadn't even realized I was walking toward it, but there I was, standing right in front of it. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The old sign was as weathered as it had always been, the wood cracked, the lettering barely legible. But then I saw it. My name. It was written in bold, clear letters, as if freshly painted, Alex's special today. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. I hadn't been to Maggie's Cafe in over a decade. The place had closed down long ago, or so I had thought. I hadn't even seen any signs of life there in years. But now, there it was. My name on the sign, like it had always been there. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe I was imagining things. But the name, the Alex's Special, it was my favorite dish from years ago, a meal I hadn't had in ages. A dish I had longed for but could never find again. I hesitated for a long moment before pushing the door open. The bell above the door jingled, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of something I couldn't quite place hung in the air. The walls, once painted a cheerful yellow, were now peeling, the once lively furniture now faded and worn. The place was just as I remembered it, except it wasn't. It was as if time had stopped here. "Welcome back," Alex, a voice called from behind the counter. I turned sharply. The voice was familiar, but I hadn't heard it in years. Maggie, the owner. She looked exactly as I remembered her, round face, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, a kind smile that always made you feel at home. Have a seat, she said, gesturing toward an empty booth. Your special is almost ready. I was frozen again. Maggie couldn't have known it was me. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. How could she know who I was, or that I was the one who used to order that dish all the time? The special, the one that had been taken off the menu after I left. I could feel my throat tighten, a lump forming as I tried to process what was happening. I don't understand, I stammered, my voice shaky. How do you know I? Maggie smiled softly. I remember you, Alex. It's been a long time, but you were always here. You and your special. You're still the only one who ever ordered it. The words hung in the air like a weight pressing on my chest. I felt like I was suffocating, like something wasn't right, like there was something I was missing. I don't know how you're doing this, Maggie, I said, my voice shaking. This place. I thought it was closed. It's been years. How is it still here? How are you? Sit down, Maggie interrupted gently, her smile never faltering. It's all right. You'll understand soon enough. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to walk away, but something deep inside me compelled me to sit down. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. I took a seat, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the dim lighting casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, even though no one else was there. The silence hung heavy, like it was waiting for something. I watched as Maggie moved behind the counter, preparing the dish. She worked in silence, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was caught in some kind of trance. And then, the smell. The unmistakable smell of the dish I had not tasted in years, my special. It wafted toward me, filling the air with an almost sickening sweetness. My stomach growled, and I felt a strange pull, a yearning for something that I couldn't quite explain. You're not going to regret it, Alex, Maggie said quietly, her back still to me as she plated the dish. You're finally getting what you've been waiting for. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. My eyes were locked on the dish as she placed it before me. It was just as I remembered it, just as I had loved it so many years ago. But there was something about it that felt wrong. Something about it that didn't belong. And then, as I stared down at the plate, I saw something. A note. Tucked under the edge of the plate, barely visible. I reached for it without thinking, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. The message was simple, but it made my heart stop. Enjoy, Alex. But remember, once you taste it, you can never leave. The words burned into my mind. I stared at the note, my hands shaking. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming or perhaps hallucinating. But no, the note was real. The paper was old but sturdy, being fresh. And clear. The words on it felt heavy, like they carried some dreadful weight, and they made the room feel smaller, tighter. Once you taste it, you can never leave. The words echoed in my mind as I looked at the plate in front of me. The dish, my special, was exactly how I remembered it. It looked perfect, tantalizing, almost too good to be true. I could smell it, the rich, mouth-watering aroma. A mixture of excitement and unease twisted in my stomach. I hadn't tasted this in years. How could I resist? It was the one dish that had haunted my thoughts, the one flavor I had longed for but thought was lost forever. And here it was, in front of me, as though time itself had been to make it happen. But the note, the warning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to leave, to not touch the food. But I had to know. I had to understand what was going on, why I had been brought here, why this cafe, after all these years, was reopening just for me. With trembling hands, I picked up my fork. The moment it touched the dish, I felt a strange jolt run through me, as if the fork itself were a conduit for something. A sensation of cold spread up my arm, but I ignored it, forcing myself to take a bite. The taste, it was perfect. Exactly as I remembered it, rich and comforting, like the first bite of something familiar, something lost but never forgotten. The warmth spread through me as I ate, and for a moment, I felt at peace, like everything had fallen into place. But then, something shifted. The taste, which had been so perfect, began to change. It wasn't a gradual shift, it was sudden and violent, like a switch had been flipped. The comforting flavor turned sour, sharp, like spoiled food. I recoiled, pushing the plate away, but the taste lingered, coating my mouth with a bitterness that made my stomach turn. My throat burned. My chest tightened. The room seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick and suffocating. I tried to stand up, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt heavy, rooted to the booth, as though the very air around me had become a trap. "Maggie," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening? What is this?" But Maggie didn't answer. She was standing behind the counter, smiling, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her smile was too wide, too knowing. "You shouldn't have eaten it, Alex," she said softly, her voice cold and distant. "But you couldn't resist, could you?" I tried to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The more I struggled, the more the room seemed to warp around me. The walls, the furniture, they were distorting, shifting in and out of focus like a bad dream. I could hear a soft humming sound, like a low, distant vibration, coming from all directions at once. I was trapped. There was no escape. The door to the cafe swung open with a sudden, violent force, slamming against the wall. The cold wind rushed in, carrying with it a sense of emptiness, of something waiting just beyond the threshold. The smell of the food, the warmth of the room, it was all fading, replaced by the sharp, biting cold of the outside world. I turned toward the door, my vision swimming, but there was nothing there. Just an empty, fog-covered street stretching out into nothingness. "Please," I whispered, my voice weak. "Let me out. I don't want this." But Maggie just smiled, that same unnerving smile, as she slowly walked toward me. Her footsteps were soft, too soft, as though she was gliding over the floor. "You'll never leave, Alex," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum that seemed to be growing louder. "Not now. Not after you've tasted it." I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I touched the handle. It was cold to the touch, and as I gripped it harder, I could feel a strange resistance. It was like the door was alive, holding me back. I pulled with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. And then, I saw it. In the reflection of the glass door, behind me, a shadow moving in the corner of the cafe. A figure, tall and thin, almost human, but not quite. Its outline was blurry, like smoke swirling in the air. It was watching me, waiting. "Who is that?" I choked, my voice barely a whisper. Maggie didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tattered book. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the pages as she looked at me with those same, empty eyes. "This was always meant to happen, Alex," she said softly. "The dish was just the beginning. It brings you closer. It ties you here." I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the reflection was closer now, its eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the dark. It was growing stronger, its form solidifying. The humming sound was now a full-blown roar, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. "You're trapped," Maggie whispered, and I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. "Just like the others." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring wind, the sound of something dark and endless. The walls of the cafe were closing in, and I was surrounded by shadows that stretched too long, too far. Suddenly, I understood. It wasn't just the food. It wasn't just the dish. The cafe itself was a trap, a place that had existed outside of time, a place where those who tasted its special dish were lost forever. Each one of us, tied to this place, trapped in the same endless loop. And now, it was my turn. I had eaten the special. I could never leave. The door was locked. The shadows were closing in. And in the distance, I could hear the faint, echoing sound of a new name being written on the sign above the door. It was mine. But soon, it would belong to someone else. I could feel the coldness creeping into my bones, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to sink straight into my soul. The shadows, once mere outlines, were becoming more distinct, more tangible. The figure behind me, no longer a blur, but a dark, gaunt shape, was growing closer with every second. Its eyes glowed brighter now, burning with an unnatural fire. I had to move. I had to do something, anything. I grabbed at the door again, this time with desperation, my hands slick with sweat. I pulled with all the strength I had left, but the door wouldn't budge. The more I struggled, the more I felt something shifting inside me, as if the very act of resisting was making it worse. The walls of the cafe were closing in, inch by inch, suffocating me in their narrow grip. "Maggie," I gasped, spinning around to face her. "What is this? What do you want from me?" She didn't respond at first. Instead, she continued flipping through the pages of the book, her fingers moving over the yellowed paper like she was searching for something. Her expression was unreadable, distant. She seemed to be lost in whatever she was reading, but then, as though remembering I was still there, she looked up and met my eyes. "Want from you?" she repeated softly, as if the words didn't quite register. "I don't want anything from you, Alex. This is just the way things are. It's always been this way." Her voice was calm, too calm, like she was speaking of something as normal as the weather. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a hint of something darker, something that sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I stepped back, glancing around the room. It felt as though it was no longer a cafe at all, but something else, something ancient and hollow. The tables, the chairs, the cracked windows, they were all distorted, like the room had become a reflection in a broken mirror. Everything was warped, shifting, as if it no longer obeyed the rules of the world I knew. You're trapped here, too, aren't you?" I asked, my voice cracking. I barely recognized myself. I was desperate now, grasping at anything that made sense. You're not real. This place, it's not real. You're not real. Maggie didn't flinch at my accusation. Instead, she closed the book with a soft snap and finally stood up, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. The air around her seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and as she neared, I felt the room grow colder still. "I'm as real as you," she said, her voice low and filled with something I couldn't place. Sympathy? Pity? Or something far more sinister? "We're all real here, Alex. But in this place, it's different. We're not meant to leave. Not anymore." I backed away, my legs shaking, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The figure in the reflection, the one that had been slowly creeping toward me, was now standing directly behind me. I could feel its presence, the pressure of something lurking just out of sight, breathing down my neck. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't turn around. But I had no choice. I slowly, painfully, turned to face the thing that had been following me. It wasn't human. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching far beyond what was natural. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those burning eyes, were fixed on me, gleaming with hunger. It didn't speak, but I felt its malice, a deep, consuming emptiness that clawed at my insides. "You," I whispered, my voice breaking. "What are you?" It didn't answer. Instead, it reached for me, its fingers impossibly long and cold as they brushed against my skin. I gasped in horror, the touch sending a jolt of ice through my body. I tried to pull away, but its grip was stronger than any force I had ever known. From the corner of my eye, I saw Maggie watching me, her face expressionless. "You're too late, Alex," she said quietly, almost mournfully. "You ate the special. You tasted the past, and now you're bound to it. To us." I didn't understand. My mind was swimming, my body frozen, caught between the pull of the figure and the cold truth of Maggie's words. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was lost in the overwhelming silence, consumed by the unnatural stillness of the room. And then, I understood. The cafe was more than just a place. It was a trap, a point in time, a place outside of the normal flow of the world. Those who entered, who tasted the special, were drawn into its grip, bound to the place for eternity. The figure behind me, whatever it was, wasn't just a creature. It was part of the cafe, part of the cycle. It was one of the lost, one of the many who had entered the cafe, tasted the dish, and never left. And now, it was my turn. I tried to fight it. I tried to push the figure away, but it was no use. Its grip tightened, and I could feel myself slipping away, my body losing all sensation, my mind clouding with the weight of the truth. I was trapped. This place, this cafe, it wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a place that fed on memories, on desires, on the things we couldn't let go. And once you entered, once you tasted its offerings, there was no escaping. I was bound to it now. My name would be written on the sign, just as it had been before. And when the next person came, when they saw it, they would walk in just as I had, and they would fall into the same trap. There was no escaping it. No escaping the loop. And all I could do was watch, as the shadows closed in around me, and the sound of the wind outside grew distant, like the fading echo of something forgotten. The figure's eyes burned into me, and I realized with a sinking heart this was my fate now. I would never leave. And neither would they. The darkness around me deepened, like a thick fog, swallowing up everything, every sound, every sight. The coldness that had once been a sharp sensation now felt like it was part of me, woven into my very bones. I was no longer sure where I ended and the cafe began. The boundaries of my reality were blurring. Maggie was standing at the counter again, but now she seemed farther away, as though I were looking at her through a heavy lens. She wasn't smiling anymore, not that I expected her to. There was nothing but quiet acceptance in her face, as though everything had happened the way it was supposed to. "You've met him," she said softly, her voice far too calm for the situation. "He's one of the first, Alex. A reminder of what happens when you taste the dish. The others, they'll be here soon." I shivered. The figure behind me, no, the shadow, was still there, its eyes glowing in the corners of my vision, but it wasn't moving. It was just waiting. Waiting for something. Maggie glanced toward the door, and I followed her gaze. The door that had been locked, the door that had been impossible to open, now stood wide. The wind howled outside, but the cafe itself was silent, untouched by the storm outside. There was only the stillness, the humming sound still pulsing through the air. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey my mind. I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something I couldn't escape. "They're coming," Maggie said again, her voice almost detached. "They always do. Every time. New faces, new souls to feed the cycle." I turned toward her, but her eyes were not on me. They were looking beyond me, toward the door, as if waiting for something, someone. That's why I saw them. Figures, shadows moving just outside the doorway. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a reflection of my fear. But then the figures came closer, stepping into the dim light of the cafe. They were human, or at least they looked it. But something about them was wrong. Their eyes were empty, hollow, their skin pale and cracked, as if time had forgotten them. They moved slowly, their steps almost synchronized, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My breath caught in my throat as they filed in, one by one. They didn't look at me, no. Their eyes were fixed on Maggie, each of them walking toward her like they had known her for centuries. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't seem startled. She just stood there, waiting for them to approach. "Are they?" I couldn't finish the sentence. The words seemed to choke me, to tie my tongue in knots. But Maggie knew what I meant. She turned to me, her gaze piercing. "They were like you once," she said quietly. "They were drawn here. Just like you. Just like I was. And now, they're part of the cafe, part of the cycle. You will be, too. Soon." The figures continued to file in, some of them smiling, others silent, their faces locked in strange, permanent expressions of longing, of hunger. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to see me as they took their places in the room, their presence filling the space like a fog. I felt their eyes on me, even if they didn't look at me. It was as though I could sense their intentions, their connection to the cafe, their pull. They were like ghosts, tethered to this place, unable to escape. I realized then that they were waiting for me. They were waiting for me to accept my place, to stop fighting, to join them in this eternal prison. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Not like them. I had to find a way out. I couldn't let myself become another lost soul, another shadow that wandered the halls of this cursed place for eternity. I had to try, no matter how futile it seemed. I turned to the door, my heart pounding. Maybe if I could get outside, I could escape the grip of the cafe, break free from the cycle. But as I moved toward it, the shadows seemed to stretch, to close in, pushing me back. And then I heard it. The sound that had been absent until now, the low, rattling noise that started as a whisper but grew louder with every passing second. It was coming from the figures, from the shadows. They were all whispering now, their voices blending together into a single, chilling murmur. "Join us, join us, join us." The whispering filled the room, drowning out all other sound. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, in my head, in my soul. It was calling me, pulling me toward them, into their web. I tried to turn away, to block it out, but the voices only grew louder. They were drowning me in their emptiness, in their despair. Their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, followed my every movement. The figure closest to me, its face twisted into something almost human but grotesque in its distortion, reached out to me. It touched my arm, its fingers icy cold, and for the briefest moment, I felt the crushing weight of what they were offering. It wasn't death. Not exactly. It was worse. It was a promise of eternity in this place, bound to the cafe, to the others who had come before, to the endless cycle that would never end. A promise that, once you tasted the dish, you would never leave. A promise that you would join the shadows, become one with the cycle, and never be free. I could feel my will weakening, my resolve faltering under the weight of the pull. I was so close. I could almost feel the peace, the surrender, the quiet acceptance. But something deep inside me, something primal, fought back. I refused to accept it. I broke free from the figure's grasp, stumbling backward. The voices seemed to howl in fury as I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care what was chasing me. I just needed to get out, to break free from this nightmare. But as I ran, I could hear them behind me. The whispers, the footsteps, the figures that moved in the shadows, always just out of sight but never far enough. I ran, and I ran, and I ran, until I reached the door. It was still open, the cold wind howling outside, a reminder of what awaited me beyond. I hesitated for a moment, but then, without looking back, I stepped outside. And the door slammed shut behind me. But as I stood there, in the cold, the silence grew heavy. Something was wrong. The street, the world outside, it didn't feel the same. It wasn't the same. I looked at the sign above the cafe. The name hadn't changed. It was still there. And then I saw it. A new name, written beneath mine. The cycle had started again. And I was no longer free. I was just another part of the cafe's endless loop. And I would never leave. The cold air cut through me, the world outside feeling surreal, distorted. The streets seemed too quiet, too still. There were no sounds of cars, no chatter from passers-by, no distant hum of the city. It was as though the world beyond the cafe had been suspended, frozen in time. I stared at the sign above the cafe, my heart sinking further into my chest. The name hadn't changed, not really. But beneath it, a new name was etched, freshly written as if it had always been there. And it was familiar, too familiar. It was mine. Alex, again. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that clouded my thoughts. I had walked out of that cafe, hadn't I? I had stepped outside, broken free, but now I was standing on the same street, looking at the same sign, feeling the same dread crawl up my spine. I turned to look behind me, but the cafe was gone. The place I had just stepped out of had vanished, replaced by an empty alleyway. No door, no windows, just darkness stretching into an unknown distance. The streetlights flickered, their dim light casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch toward me. I could feel it. The pull. It was like the cafe was still there, even if I couldn't see it. Like it was calling me, waiting for me to return. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of something looming, something watching from the depths, gripped me with an icy certainty. And then, I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps echoing softly behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. The alleyway was empty, nothing but shadows and the lingering chill in the air. But the footsteps, they were real. They were getting closer, closer with every passing moment. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. The footsteps stopped. For a long, drawn-out second, everything was still. And then, I saw him. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, no, something, emerging from the blackness. His outline was blurry at first, a distortion in the air, but as he stepped closer, his features became clearer. He was wearing the same kind of tattered clothes I had seen on the others, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I could feel the weight of his presence, his eyes boring into me, and I knew. I knew who he was. He was like the others. He had been here before. And now, he was part of the cycle, waiting, just as Maggie had been. The man reached for me, his hand extending slowly. I froze, the sight of his outstretched fingers sending a jolt of terror through my body. "Join us," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with a strange, chilling weight. "Join us, and the loop will end. You'll be free." His voice was like a magnet, pulling me closer. But I fought it. I had to fight it. There was no escape, not unless I found a way to sever the connection, to break the chain that bound me to this place, to this never-ending cycle. The shadows around him seemed to shift, like they were alive, crawling toward me, reaching out with fingers that weren't human, that weren't real. I stumbled back, my feet tripping over the uneven pavement. The man, no, the thing, followed, his pace slow but sure, like a predator closing in on its prey. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The alleyway seemed endless, stretching on, the shadows closing in tighter, suffocating me. I could hear him behind me now, his footsteps echoing, growing louder, closer. His presence was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me from all directions. "Please, no. Not again." I reached the end of the alley, the cold wind rushing past me, but there was no escape. The street I had once known, and once thought I had left, was gone. The familiar world was gone. I was standing in front of the cafe again. The door, the windows, the flickering sign, it was all there, waiting for me. And beneath the name, a new one had appeared. Another name, another soul bound to the cycle. It was mine. And just like that, I understood. I wasn't free. I had never been free. The cafe wasn't just a place, it was an anchor, a part of something far larger than I had ever realized. And now, I was just another part of it. Another name on the list. Another shadow in the loop. The door opened slowly, and I knew what I had to do. I had to walk back in. There was no other choice. The cycle had to continue. I stepped through the door, and the world I had once known faded away. Inside, the shadows waited. And as I walked further into the darkness, I heard the familiar whisper of the others echoing around me. Join us, join us, join us. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the story now, and I would never leave. I would never escape the loop. And in time, another soul would walk through that door, and they would find their name written beneath mine. The cycle would begin again. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to find yourself standing alone, surrounded by nothing but emptiness, only to discover that the world around you isn't as empty as it seems? I hadn't thought much about it before. But that day, walking along the beach, it became impossible to ignore. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the faint breeze of salt air, and the warm sand beneath my feet, everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I was alone, just like I wanted. A quiet escape from everything. But then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks with the sand, something natural, nothing to worry about. There were footprints, simple and unremarkable, leading off into the distance. Nothing unusual until I realized something. The footprints were not mine. I paused, staring down at the sand. I could see them clearly now. The marks were deep, like someone had walked here recently, but I was sure I had been the only one on this stretch of beach. There were no other footsteps in the sand, no signs of anyone else. I moved closer to the prints. They started near my feet, as though someone had walked right up to me, and then they vanished. The trail didn't lead anywhere. No person walking away, no fading of steps into the distance. It simply began and ended at the same spot, my own. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the edge of the sand. The prints were fresh, as if they had been made only moments ago. But the longer I looked, the stranger they seemed. They didn't have a shape I recognized. They weren't quite human, not exactly. The way they curved, too symmetrical. Too perfect. A cold chill washed over me, and my mind started to race. I stood up quickly, glancing around, but nothing had changed. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions. The same open, empty space. I looked behind me. My own footprints trailed back, where I had come from, just like they always did. But these prints, they didn't belong. I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest. I should have left, should have turned around and gone back to the safety of my car. But something kept me there, frozen in place. A curiosity I couldn't shake. A nagging feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put into words. I felt like I was being watched. The wind shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a faint whisper, carried by the breeze. I turned, but saw nothing. The only sound was the steady crash of waves. I took a deep breath, my thoughts racing. Could I have imagined it? Could it have been a trick of the mind? But no! I knew what I had seen. The prints were real. Too real. I stepped forward, slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb the marks in the sand. My eyes never left them. They had to be from someone else, right? A walker, a wanderer, someone just passing by. But then again, why hadn't I seen them? Another step. And then another. I moved along the beach, trying to follow the trail. But the prints didn't extend far enough for me to find anything. They stopped just ahead, fading like they'd been erased by an invisible hand. They were gone. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of my heartbeat, the only noise in the otherwise silent world. The waves crashing, the breeze, nothing else. I looked down at my feet, my own print still there in the sand, leading back toward the distant edge of the beach. But there, at my feet, was the unmistakable shape of the strange footprints once again. They started at my feet. How could that be? My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was sure now. Something was wrong. Something was happening here that I couldn't explain. I turned quickly, looking in all directions. But still, no one. The beach was empty. Yet the prints remained. And they were getting closer. Every step I took, they followed. No sound, no figure, just the shape of someone or something walking along beside me, but always at my side. I took another step, my feet dragging through the soft sand. The sound of my footsteps, slow and deliberate, mixed with the faint rustle of the wind. It should have been peaceful, but the feeling of unease had settled deep in my chest, like an unwanted visitor. Something was off. I glanced down again. The footprints. They hadn't moved from the spot near my feet. They were still there, as though waiting for something. Or for someone. I took a deep breath and stepped back, hoping the movement would break the eerie connection, but the print stayed locked in place, a mirror to my own. I could feel a shift in the air, a subtle change in the way the breeze moved, like the world was holding its breath. Then it happened. I felt it before I saw it. The strange presence, creeping into my awareness like a shadow in the corner of my mind. A subtle pressure. Like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. My heartbeat quickened, and my hands trembled. The sand around my feet shifted slightly, as if the wind was stirring, but the air didn't feel right. It felt thick, unnatural. I spun around, but there was no one. Just the beach, stretching out before me, empty and silent. But something was there. I could feel it, pressing against me, waiting. The stillness was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. I looked down at the footprints again. They hadn't moved. They remained in the sand at the very spot where I had stood. My breath caught in my throat. Why were they still there? I took another cautious step back, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of life, any explanation for what was happening. Nothing. Was I imagining it? I closed my eyes for a brief second, trying to clear my mind, but when I opened them again, the footprints had changed. The shape was still the same, but now there were two sets of prints. One starting at my feet, the other trailing behind me, as if I had been followed all along. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The prints weren't mine. They weren't like mine at all. They were smaller, more delicate, the arch of each foot too soft, too fluid. I turned again, faster this time, but the beach remained still. Empty. Quiet. And yet, I'd felt them. The eyes watching me. I could feel the weight of them, sharp and intense, from behind. Someone was there. I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned back to face the prints, my pulse hammering in my throat. I was shaking now, each movement heavier than the last. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong, something was following me, waiting for me to make a move. I looked down one more time, my breath shallow, and I saw it. The prints didn't just appear at my feet. They shifted. They were deeper now, more pronounced, as if someone was walking right next to me. A figure that hadn't been there before. Someone, or something, was walking alongside me, and it had no intention of stopping. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding louder than the sound of the waves. The prints didn't just follow me. They mirrored my every movement, the steps perfectly aligned with my own, but at a distance. I could feel it, whatever was with me, its presence closing in. I stopped and stared, the panic creeping in now, settling into my chest. Was it just in my mind? Was I losing myself to the isolation of the beach, to the silence that stretched so long it seemed to swallow everything? I crouched down and placed my hand on the sand where the prints began. They felt cold. Not like the warm sand around them. A coldness spread from where I touched it, sharp and unnatural. Suddenly, I felt the shift in the air again. A presence, far closer than before. I stood quickly, spinning around once more, this time not to look, but to feel. And there it was. A shadow, sharp and distorted, stretched across the sand, but no one was there. The shadow writhed, as if trying to shape itself into something more defined, more real. But no, there was nothing there. No figure. Only the empty beach, the footprints, and the growing sense of terror. I turned and walked away, quicker this time, my feet sinking deeper into the sand with every frantic step. I looked ahead, but nothing changed. Still the same beach, still the same endless horizon. The waves crashed, and the wind howled, but something was different now. I could feel the steps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking at the same pace, keeping up with me, never too far behind, but always just close enough for me to feel it. The sand around my feet shifted again, as if the earth itself was following my every move. I couldn't escape. Every direction led me back to where I started. The footprints, the footsteps, they were still there, and they were always going to be. I didn't dare stop. Not now. I couldn't. Because if I did, I was certain that something, someone, would catch up with me. And I wasn't sure I'd survive it. My legs ached with every step, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. The feeling of being followed, of something constantly just behind me, kept pushing me forward, even though my mind screamed to stop, to run, to leave the beach behind. But where could I go? The shore stretched endlessly in both directions. There was nowhere to hide. I glanced over my shoulder again. The shadow was still there, but it wasn't exactly a shadow anymore. It had become more defined, more solid, shifting in a way that felt unnatural, like it was bending around something that wasn't entirely present. Every time I turned my head, it was just a little bit closer. I picked up the pace, my breath shallow, my chest tightening. It was as though the sand was pulling me in, each step growing heavier, the weight of the beach itself pressing down on me. The waves crashed louder now, almost as if they were in rhythm with my panicked heartbeat, filling my ears with a sound that drowned out everything else, everything but the footsteps behind me. The prints, those strange, delicate prints, were still there, always in perfect sync with my own. They seemed to be following me, not merely tracking my movements, but mimicking them like a reflection in a mirror that hadn't quite come into focus. I stopped. I didn't want to, but my legs gave out beneath me. My body had reached its limit. I collapsed to my knees on the sand, gasping for breath. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as though it was alive with some dark energy. My fingers dug into the sand, grounding myself to the earth in a futile attempt to escape the growing tension. The world seemed to pause for a moment. The waves didn't crash. The wind didn't blow. Even the distant cries of gulls were silenced, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible at first, like a murmur carried by the wind. But then it became clearer, sharper, and I could make out the words. It's not over. I shot to my feet, my heart racing in my chest. My eyes searched the horizon, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no one. No figure. No movement. Just the beach, just the prints, those goddamn prints, still trailing behind me, still perfectly aligned with every step I had taken. But the whisper, it wasn't just in the wind. It was inside my head. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my mind. Was I losing it? Was this madness, or was I really hearing something? No. I couldn't ignore it. The feeling was too real. I could feel the presence pressing against me, growing stronger with every passing second. I turned back to face the trail of footprints. They had begun to change again. The marks weren't just footprints now, they had become imprints, like something had pressed its weight down on the sand. The sand around them was darker, more disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged through it. And then, as I watched, the footprints began to move. Not in the way they had before. Not like someone walking behind me. No. They were moving toward me. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. The prints were shifting, closing the distance between me and the point where I had collapsed. They were advancing, not retreating. And with each step they took, a low hum began to reverberate through the ground. It was a sound I could feel in my bones, like the earth itself was vibrating. I staggered backward, panic surging through me. I had to move. I had to run. But my legs were heavy, too heavy, as if the beach was trying to pull me back down into the sand. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were no longer a whisper but a voice. A voice that was soft, but chilling, like it was speaking from far below, from the very earth itself. Come back to me. I stumbled, eyes wide with terror, my body trembling. The footprints, they were too close now. Too real. I could feel them. I could feel them reaching for me. I ran. But the moment I turned, something stopped me. The air, thick and suffocating, seemed to push against me. The sand beneath my feet was no longer solid, it was soft, treacherous, sucking me in like quicksand. Every step I took, I sank deeper. I cried out, my legs unable to carry me any longer. My chest burned, my heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the distant waves. And then, it happened. The ground beneath me gave way. My body fell forward, a scream catching in my throat as I plunged into the sand. But there was no pain. No harsh landing. The sand swallowed me whole, wrapping around my limbs, pulling me down with an unnatural force. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't see. The world was swallowed by darkness. The whispers were gone. The sand was still. But I knew, without a doubt, that something had found me. Something that had been waiting. And then, as my vision began to blur and the coldness crept deeper into my bones, I understood the truth. The footprints weren't just following me. They were meant to bring me back. Back to where it all began. Back to where I was never meant to leave. And as the darkness closed in around me, I finally realized the beach wasn't empty. I had never been alone. I don't know how long I was lost in that void, in that thick, consuming darkness. Time ceased to exist. My body was suspended in a cold, silent weight, as if I had been swallowed whole by the very earth beneath the sand. When I finally regained some sense of awareness, I wasn't sure if I had woken up or if I was still dreaming, or worse, still trapped. My hands reached out, but there was nothing to feel. Nothing solid. Just an oppressive emptiness. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I felt like I was sinking deeper, the weight of something unseen pressing against me from every direction. It wasn't physical. It was psychological, a pressure from within, a crushing sensation that filled me with panic. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, but the air was thick and suffocating. I couldn't breathe. And then, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like the sound of distant waves, but slowly, steadily, they grew louder, clearer. The voices were familiar now, not just a random murmur, but something that felt personal, something that knew me, knew my name. Come back. The voice was soft, seductive, the kind of voice you might hear in your dreams, the kind that calls you in, wraps around you, promising peace. But there was nothing peaceful about it. It was a command, a summons. My body began to tremble again as the sand began to shift, to stir around me. I gasped for air, feeling the suffocating pressure in my chest loosen just slightly, enough for me to inhale sharply. The ground was shifting. I was moving. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. I felt the pull. The magnetic force that was dragging me somewhere, pulling me down into the depths. Into something deeper than the earth. Something ancient. Something waiting. I tried to move, to free myself, but it was like trying to move through tar. Every motion felt slow and painful, every inch of my body resisting the pull, but it was too strong. I was too weak. Then, through the murk of darkness, I saw something, a faint, flickering light. It was small, distant, but it was there. A beacon in the void. I focused on it, desperately, reaching out with whatever strength I had left. The pressure continued to press on me, but I clawed at the sand, trying to free myself from its grip, trying to pull myself toward the light. As I moved, the whispers grew louder, and with them came the unmistakable feeling of presence, of something watching me. Something closer than before, its presence so real I could almost feel it breathing on my skin. The light grew brighter, and with it, the pressure seemed to release, just a little. It was a fleeting sensation, but enough to make me think I could break free, that I could escape whatever had been calling to me. But then, the voice whispered again, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. You cannot leave. The words sliced through me, sharp and cold. I froze, my body locking in place as the world around me seemed to freeze as well. The light, the distant hope, flickered once, then dimmed. I couldn't move. My limbs were stiff. The sand beneath me felt like concrete. The air was thick with the presence of something ancient, something bound to the earth itself. And then, from the darkness, it came. A figure. It was not human, but it was not a thing either. It was an idea. A shape that moved in and out of focus, like it was made of shadows and memory, its edges not quite there, flickering in and out of existence. It was tall, towering, yet formless, like a silhouette etched into the dark canvas of the world. The whispers stopped. and for a moment everything was silent. Then the figure spoke. "You should not have come back." Its voice was not the same as the whispers. It was deep, reverberating through the sand, vibrating through my bones. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that shook the very fabric of reality around me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The terror inside me was paralyzing, but at the same time, there was a strange pull, a connection between me and the shadow. It reached toward me, not with arms, but with an overwhelming presence that filled every inch of space. It was like a void, a darkness that consumed everything in its path. The air around me began to freeze again, the sand beneath me growing colder, harder. The pressure returned, stronger this time, as though the very earth was crushing me from all sides. But then, the figure paused. It tilted its head, as if curious, and in that moment, the words came again, sharp and clear, but this time, there was something else in them. "You were never meant to leave." The figure seemed to grow even darker, the shadows swirling around it. My heart raced as the darkness around it pressed in closer. It was no longer just a figure, it was the thing that had been following me, the thing that had always been there. The one that had been walking alongside me, in the sand, in the shadows. I had never left the beach. And now, I was being pulled back to where it all began. To the depths of the earth, where things that should not have been buried were waiting. The sand shifted beneath me again. My body was pulled lower, sinking deeper. I could feel the cold, the pressure, and I understood. The beach had never been empty. The footprints had never stopped following me. They were mine. The darkness around me thickened, and the weight of the presence pressing down on me felt suffocating, unbearable. I could feel the sand closing in, inch by inch, creeping up my legs, my chest, as though the earth itself had come alive to claim me. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed whole, as if the very air was too thick for my voice to escape. The figure loomed over me, its shadow stretching impossibly far, its formless body flickering like a half-formed nightmare, too real and too unreal at once. "You should have stayed away," the voice rumbled, its words echoing through me, shaking the ground beneath my feet. It was not a threat, not a warning, but an inevitability, a cold certainty. "You belong to the beach now. You always have." I tried to move, to fight, but it was useless. My limbs were heavy, as if shackled by invisible chains. The sand clung to me, and every breath felt like it could be my last. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. A part of me that had been buried, hidden beneath the fear, beneath the weight of the impossible truth. A fragment of memory. The beach. The footprints. The endless stretch of sand. It wasn't just a place I had stumbled upon. It was a place I had always been. A place I had always belonged. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I wasn't just part of the beach, I was the beach. I was the sand, the waves, the wind. The figure wasn't a separate entity. It was a reflection of what I had become, of what I was always meant to be. A part of something ancient, something forgotten by time. The whispers, the presence, the pull, they weren't some external force trying to claim me. They were the echoes of my own soul, reaching out, calling me back to my rightful place. I was the footprints. I was the one who walked along the shore, not leaving, but returning. I closed my eyes, accepting the truth, the terrible truth that had been with me all along. This beach, this place of isolation, of silence, had never been a prison. It had been my home, my only home. And now, I would return to it, to become one with the sand, the waves, and the wind. The pressure around me intensified, and I felt my body sink lower, deeper into the earth, as the last remnants of my former self slipped away. There was no struggle left. No fear. Only the pull, the ancient call of the beach, guiding me back to where I had always belonged. And as the darkness consumed me, I finally understood. I was never meant to leave. The beach had never been empty. It had been waiting for me all along. And now, with the final step, I was home. The sand shifted one last time, and everything went still. The last footprint on the shore disappeared, erased by the tide. It had been a normal day, at least it seemed like one. A regular afternoon, with the dull hum of the city in the background, the kind of noise that often goes unnoticed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a simple notification, something from the hospital. I had been there earlier in the week for a routine checkup, nothing serious. Maybe this was just a follow-up. But something about it felt off. I opened the message as I walked home, expecting a note about the results of a test I had forgotten about. But instead, it was an attachment, an image of a medical record. My name was at the top, followed by the words, patient record, diagnosis. I had to pause. There was something in the tone of it, something too official, too final. I had never been sent anything like this before. I tapped the file to open it, feeling my heart beat faster with an inexplicable sense of dread. The first thing I noticed was the date. The record was dated for a checkup that was supposed to take place tomorrow. I had never been scheduled for an appointment that soon. I hadn't even been told about it. And yet, there it was, a diagnosis listed under it. Diagnosis: severe panic disorder with dissociative episodes. I blinked, confused. That wasn't a diagnosis I recognized. Panic disorder? Maybe. But dissociative episodes? I had never been told that, never heard that word used in relation to me. And certainly not in the context of this seemingly random checkup. I stared at the record, my mind racing. Why had I been given this diagnosis? I had felt fine. Sure, I'd been a little more stressed lately, work, life, everything, but nothing that would lead to something like this. I had never been told I was at risk for dissociative episodes, had never been warned about such a condition. And yet, here it was, in black and white. I scrolled down, trying to make sense of the notes. More strange, unnerving details followed. The handwriting, for one thing, looked too neat, too methodical. And the more I read, the more I felt like the words were slipping through my fingers, like they were just out of reach, as if the very meaning of them was being erased before I could fully comprehend it. Recommendation: immediate follow-up required. Start treatment plan as soon as possible. Psychiatric referral urgently advised. Urgent. Urgently advised. I was shaking now. None of this felt right. I hadn't been to see a psychiatrist. No one had mentioned any need for immediate follow-up. But here it was, as if I were standing on the edge of something unknown, something unseen. I scrolled further, hoping for some kind of explanation, some context that might make sense of all of this. But instead, I was met with a new, even more unsettling detail. The hospital had written a time for my next appointment. It was at 10 a.m. tomorrow. But there was no appointment scheduled. No reason to think it would be there. I couldn't understand why this record existed, why it was there, or how it had been generated. It was as if the hospital had somehow seen the future. And then the last line stopped me dead in my tracks. Please be advised, the appointment is necessary, as future events might present themselves as symptoms of this condition. Future events. What did that mean? How could they know what was going to happen? How could they have predicted that? I closed the file, but the words seemed to burn into my mind, searing themselves into my thoughts. Something was wrong, so wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My breath quickened as I felt the unmistakable weight of anxiety building in my chest. The sounds of the city around me seemed to fade, as though the world were closing in on me. I was alone with this mystery, with this impossible question: how could this record have been made? How could the hospital know about things that hadn't even happened yet? As I walked, I tried to calm myself, to reason through it, but the unease in my stomach grew. I tried to tell myself it was some sort of mistake, a glitch in the system. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Because that record, no matter how much I wished it were real, had written something I couldn't ignore. It had written my future. And the future, it seemed, was already here. The question now was, what would happen next? Would the diagnosis be a prediction or a warning? And if I didn't act, could I change what was coming for me? It started with a simple phone call. The voice on the other end, calm and polite, asked if I could stop by the clinic to pick up some documents they had prepared for me. There was nothing unusual about it. I had visited the doctor recently for a routine checkup, and the clinic had always been thorough. I thought nothing of it at the time. I didn't expect the moment when I laid eyes on the medical record. The nurse handed me the thick envelope with a brief smile, and I took it, still oblivious to the unease creeping up my spine. I barely left the building when I ripped open the envelope to find my medical chart inside. It was strange. The diagnosis listed didn't make sense. The words were so foreign to me, and yet they were written in neat, clinical language, as though they were the cold, hard truth. The condition listed was something I had never heard of, never discussed with my doctor, something that wasn't even close to what I had come in for. The date of the examination was even more bizarre. It was marked for a day in the future, one that had not yet arrived. I stared at the date for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The scribbled words on the page began to blur as my thoughts spiraled. I wasn't sure what to think. A mistake? An administrative error? It didn't seem possible. And yet, the more I stared at the page, the more I felt something was terribly wrong. My mind raced. I flipped through the rest of the documents in the envelope, but the same unsettling words appeared in each one. Each sheet confirmed the diagnosis I didn't have. I couldn't understand. I hadn't been told any of this. Confused, I headed back to the clinic, hoping to resolve the issue. The receptionist greeted me as if nothing was amiss, but the moment I showed her the record, her smile faltered. She picked up the phone and called for someone to speak with me, her hands trembling slightly. When Dr. Williams finally came out, her face was pale. "What can I do for you?" she asked, but I could hear the unease in her voice. There was a long, uncomfortable pause before she noticed the papers in my hand. I need an explanation," I said, my voice shaking. "This is my diagnosis, but I haven't had any of these tests. This isn't right. And the date, it's in the future. How can that be?" Dr. Williams hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the receptionist as if silently debating whether or not to say more. She took the papers from me without a word and examined them for a moment before looking back at me. "I don't know how this happened," she said slowly. This isn't supposed to be your record. I don't. We don't have any upcoming appointments scheduled for you. And this diagnosis, it shouldn't be here at all. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. Something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Are you telling me this is a mistake? I asked, my voice shaking. Dr. Williams didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at the papers, her expression unreadable. Then, in a quiet voice, she murmured, "You shouldn't be seeing this yet." I felt my stomach drop, the air in the room suddenly thick and stifling. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to breathe. "Just go home. We'll look into it. But don't come back until we've sorted this out." Her words were clipped, as though she was trying to push me away to avoid saying anything more. I left the clinic with the feeling that something had been left unsaid, something far worse than I could imagine. And as I stepped out into the street, the envelope in my hand felt heavier than ever. I wasn't sure if it was the weight of the diagnosis or the weight of knowing something was terribly wrong, but the air around me had shifted, and I couldn't escape the sense that whatever was happening was only just beginning. I looked down at the medical chart again. The date on the form was creeping closer, inch by inch, and in my gut, I could feel the dread. Something was coming. Something I wasn't ready for. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, but that damn medical record never left my mind. The words on the page haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to push it away, to convince myself it was nothing more than a clerical mistake, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that something far worse was at play. I tried to go about my daily life, hoping that time would make it all seem less real. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the record remained, looming over me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The diagnosis itself was bizarre, something called temporal displacement syndrome. A condition I never heard of, one that made no sense, especially in the context of my previous checkups. The date for the examination, one that hadn't yet arrived, was a constant reminder of something I couldn't control, something beyond my comprehension. It was when I finally found the courage to call my doctor again that the truth began to reveal itself, though not in the way I expected. I reached Dr. Williams late in the evening, my voice tight as I tried to explain the lingering unease that had been slowly suffocating me. Her response was clipped, her tone strained. "I told you before, just leave it for now," she said. "We're looking into it. You should rest." But the way she said it, like she was trying to rush me off the phone, as though she was afraid of something, I knew there was more to this than she was letting on. "I'm not going to rest until I understand what's happening," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. "I need answers. The date on that record is coming up, and I need to know what's going to happen." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Finally, Dr. Williams spoke, her voice low and cautious. "Don't go to the appointment," she warned, her words almost a whisper. "Don't follow through. It's not supposed to be for you." "Not for me?" I echoed, my pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" "It has my name on it." "I can't explain it right now," she said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "But trust me, don't go." The line clicked off abruptly, leaving me standing there, stunned. I stared at the phone, unable to move. What had just happened? What was going on? That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, the words temporal displacement syndrome danced in front of my vision like a dark cloud that wouldn't lift. I could feel the impending date crawling closer, inch by inch. It was almost as if it were a countdown, ticking down to something terrible, something inevitable. The next morning, I knew I had to go back to the clinic. I had no choice. Dr. Williams' warning, though chilling, only fueled my need to understand. What was I dealing with? What had she meant? And why did it feel like there was something more, something hidden, just out of reach? I arrived at the clinic in the early afternoon. The familiar building now felt cold and unwelcoming, like something was waiting for me inside, something I wasn't prepared to face. As I walked through the entrance, the receptionist greeted me, but this time there was no warm smile, no casual pleasantries. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. I felt the weight of her gaze on me as I made my way to the doctor's office. When Dr. Williams finally entered, her face was pale, the shadows under her eyes deeper than before. She seemed startled to see me, as though she hadn't expected me to come back at all. "You came," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I need answers," I replied, my voice shaking, but determined. Dr. Williams hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she was being watched, before she sat down across from me. She looked as though she had aged years in the last few days. "I don't know how to explain this," she began, her hands trembling slightly. "You're not the only one who's received this kind of record. It's been happening to other patients, people I've treated for years. The dates, the diagnoses, they don't match up. And what's worse, they're not from this time." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, not from this time?" "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think it's something out of our control. Something we're not supposed to understand." She paused, her gaze shifting to the door, then back to me. "I should have told you this earlier. But it's already started. And I don't think you can stop it anymore." I froze. My breath caught in my chest. The sound of my pulse in my ears grew louder, like a drumbeat. Something was coming. Something was already here. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Dr. Williams' face hardened. "You're not the first," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "And you won't be the last." The door to the office creaked open behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. The silence in the room was suffocating. I stared at Dr. Williams, searching for any clue, any sign that she was joking or that this was all just some strange misunderstanding. But her face remained pale, her eyes dark with something that wasn't fear, something deeper, something older. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the chair. "What do you mean, you're not the first? Who else has seen this?" I demanded, though the words barely made it out of my mouth. She looked at me, her lips tight, as if she was debating whether to speak any further. Finally, she spoke in a low voice, almost too quietly for me to hear. "There have been others. Patients who've received records like yours. Different names, different conditions, but the same unsettling dates. And, like you, none of them were ever told they had those conditions. And they never made those appointments until it was too late." I blinked, trying to process her words. "Too late? What do you mean, too late?" But before she could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice. A low hum filled the room, like electricity running through the walls. I glanced around, but everything appeared normal, just the sterile white walls, the faint smell of antiseptic, and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Dr. Williams seemed unaffected by the strange sounds, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. A chill ran down my spine. There's a pattern, she continued, her voice suddenly more urgent. A pattern we can't explain. The records aren't just mistakes, they're predictions. The dates are future dates, dates that are tied to events that haven't happened yet. I took a step forward, my confusion growing. Are you telling me that this condition, this temporal displacement syndrome, is something that's going to happen to me in the future? She nodded slowly, her eyes not meeting mine. It's not just you. It's happening to others. And if the records are right, she trailed off, glancing at the door again. Her voice dropped even lower. You're being pulled into something bigger than just a diagnosis. I don't know how it works, but I think time itself is starting to unravel. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the room suddenly feeling much smaller, the walls closing in. I couldn't breathe. Unravel? I repeated, my voice cracking. What does that even mean? I think, she began, her voice barely a whisper, you're going to have to experience what's in those records. The dates, the events. They're going to happen to you. And when they do, I think it will change everything. I opened my mouth to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my breath shallow. Something was happening. I could feel it in my bones. Before I could say anything else, the door behind me opened again. But this time, it wasn't an empty corridor. It was a hallway, dimly lit, stretching into the distance. I could hear a faint sound coming from the far end of it, something like a whisper, too soft to make out the words. I turned to Dr. Williams, my mind racing. What is this? Where did that hallway come from? She didn't answer immediately. She just stared at it, her face pale. It's happening, she said, her voice shaky. I didn't think it would start so soon. The hallway grew darker, the whispering more distinct. It sounded like voices, thousands of them, all talking at once, their words blending together into a single, incomprehensible murmur. The air felt heavy, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching, tearing at the seams. Don't go down there, Dr. Williams said urgently, but I was already moving. Something inside me pulled me toward that hallway. The pull was irresistible, like a magnetic force that I couldn't fight against. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced over my shoulder, but Dr. Williams was no longer there. The room I had been in moments ago was gone, replaced by the long, shadowy corridor that seemed to stretch into eternity. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The whispers grew louder, clearer. The words began to form, temporal displacement syndrome. The name of the condition repeated over and over, like a chant, getting louder and more frantic the further I walked. The hallway twisted, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible, as if the space itself was warping around me. I reached out to steady myself, my hand brushing against the walls. They felt wrong. The texture was off, slick and cold, like something alive. Then, ahead, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the shadows. I couldn't make out any details at first, but as I drew closer, it became clearer. This wasn't just some random shape or trick of the light. It was a person, or something that resembled one. The figure was completely still, its face hidden in the dark. Who are you? I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned, as if aware of my presence. I could hear its breath, slow and measured, like the ticking of a clock. I froze. The figure's face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. The same pull, the same magnetic force that had drawn me into the hallway now intensified. It was as if the figure was calling me, drawing me toward it. I took a step forward, and that's when it spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in my mind as much as in my ears. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, and its words echoed long after it finished speaking. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey me. The world around me seemed to warp again, the floor beneath my feet bending as if it were made of liquid. I started, but I couldn't finish. The figure took a step toward me, its movement unnatural, like something being pulled through thick air. And then, everything went black. I awoke in a place that felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence, an oppressive, thick silence, as if the world itself had been muted. My surroundings were unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and the floor beneath me creaked with every slight movement. But there were no walls, no boundaries. The space stretched on endlessly, a vast void of nothingness, broken only by the faint flicker of dim light that seemed to come from nowhere. I sat up slowly, my body aching as though I had been lying still for a long time. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the disorientation, but the haze wouldn't clear. The events in Dr. Williams's office flooded back, how the hallway had appeared, how the figure had spoken to me. The echo of its words still lingered in my mind, a warning, a threat. "You're not supposed to be here." I stood up, shakily at first, and looked around. There was nothing. Just an endless stretch of empty space, a sense of waiting that made my skin crawl. I took a few tentative steps, my footsteps soundless in the vast nothingness. A cold wind blew past me, carrying with it a distant, distorted sound, voices, muffled and faint, as if they were coming from a far-off place. I turned in the direction of the sound, instinctively following it. The whispering grew louder, clearer, but still indecipherable. Then I saw it. A figure in the distance. It was barely visible, like a shadow in the corner of my eye. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. It couldn't be the same figure from before. Could it? But the more I looked, the clearer it became. This figure was different, no longer obscured, but somehow even more unnerving. It was me. Not exactly me, but something that looked like me. The figure stood tall and still, facing away from me. The strange pull I had felt earlier was back, stronger this time. My feet moved. Against my will, carrying me toward it. I tried to resist, but it was like an invisible force was guiding me, making it impossible to stop. As I drew closer, I saw the details more clearly. The figure had the same face, the same clothes, the same posture as me, but there was something off. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by strings. The face, my face, was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that stared into the nothingness around it. I stopped just short of it, too afraid to touch it. But the figure turned, slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with me. Its gaze felt like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel it. It was me, but it wasn't. "You're me," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite my own, it spoke. "Not yet," it said, its words rasping like they had been dragged across sandpaper. "But soon." The air around me seemed to shift, the temperature dropping. The space between us felt charged, like an electrical current running through the air. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was about to happen. I didn't know what, but I could feel it, the pull, the urgency. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. Before I could speak again, the figure turned its back to me and began to walk away. The movement was slow at first, but then it picked up pace, as if it were racing towards something. I instinctively followed, unable to stop myself. With every step, the environment around us seemed to change. The endless void I had been standing in began to distort, as though the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. The space stretched and contracted, flickering like a broken film reel. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, clearer now. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, and they were speaking directly to me. They were telling me something important. Time is broken. You are the cause. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the air. I tried to block them out, but they wouldn't go away. I couldn't understand them completely, but I knew enough. I was the one who had caused this. I had broken time. The figure ahead of me stopped, turning once more. You think you've seen the end, it said, its voice colder now, more distant. But the end is only the beginning. I reached out, desperate to stop it, to ask what it meant. But as I did, the figure melted, not in the way a person melts into nothing, but as if it were fading into the very air, disintegrating before my eyes. The last thing I saw was its face, twisted into a grin, before it vanished completely. I stood alone in the distorted void. The whispers faded, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. But the words still echoed in my mind. You are the cause. I stumbled backward, feeling the ground beneath me tremble. The air thickened, becoming harder to breathe. My head spun, and I realized whatever had happened, whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. The figure, the warning, the collapsing reality, it was all real. But I had no idea how to stop it. The space around me seemed to fold in on itself, compressing, closing in tighter and tighter. I could feel myself being drawn back toward the beginning, toward the records, toward the appointment that hadn't happened yet. And as everything around me began to darken, I realized one thing: the future was already here. The darkness closed in around me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel the walls of reality collapsing, crushing me under their weight. But even in this moment of pure terror, there was a strange clarity in my mind. The figure, the warning, the shattered time, it was all connected, a loop that had already begun, one that I was part of. I wasn't just caught in it, I was it. The ground beneath me was no longer solid. My feet sank, and with each movement, I felt myself slipping deeper into the void. Panic surged in my chest, but I couldn't scream. There was no air, no sound, just the overwhelming sense of inevitability. The whispers returned, louder now, like 1,000 voices whispering at once, their words indistinguishable but urgent. You broke it, they said in unison. You will fix it. The more I tried to move, the further away the ground seemed to stretch. There was no up or down, no sense of direction. I was floating in a space where time no longer existed, where past, present, and future were all blurred into one. But then I saw it, the faintest glimmer of light. At first, it was just a flicker, a distant star in the endless expanse. But as I focused on it, it grew brighter, sharper. The light pulled at me, tugging at my soul, as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. I reached for it instinctively, knowing that it was my only chance. With every inch I moved, the light grew stronger, more defined. It became a doorway, glowing with a strange energy. And beyond it, I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel something waiting for me. I stepped forward, my feet meeting solid ground for the first time in what felt like forever. The world around me shifted, the void retreating into the distance. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of my own breath, loud, ragged, but real. I was back. Or so it seemed. I stepped through the doorway. The world on the other side was not what I expected. I stood in the hallway of Dr. Williams's office once more, the same sterile walls, the same cold, unfeeling atmosphere. But everything felt different now. The air was thick with tension, and there was a buzzing in my ears, a constant hum that never stopped. The appointment time on the clock had changed. It was earlier than before, but not just by a few minutes. The hands of the clock were spinning faster, the seconds ticking away with unnatural speed. I turned to look at the door to Dr. Williams's office, but it wasn't there anymore. Instead, I saw a single sheet of paper taped to the wall, an old-fashioned medical chart with my name written at the top. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The paper was yellowed, aged, as though it had been there for decades. My hands shook as I reached for it, unable to tear my gaze away from the text. The words on the chart were the same as before, but they had changed. The diagnosis had changed. The date was different, and there, at the bottom, in bold black ink, was the final entry. Appointment, date in the future. Diagnosis, unknown. It was a warning, a sign that the cycle was repeating, but I couldn't break free. The loop had already begun, and I had no idea how to escape it. I turned, my eyes frantically searching for a way out. The hallway stretched on endlessly, each door leading to another version of the same sterile space. The walls seemed to move, shifting like liquid, never staying in place for long. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slowly at first, then faster, growing louder and louder, echoing through the hallway. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I turned back toward the door I had come through, but it was gone. There was only the hallway, stretching out in all directions, infinite and suffocating. I stumbled, feeling the world tilt beneath me, and I realized the cycle wasn't just something I was in. It was something I had created. I had broken it, and now there was no way to fix it. Time had twisted, warped, and I was trapped, forever bound to this endless loop. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel my heart racing as I turned to face the approaching figure, knowing that whatever awaited me on the other side was the same as what I had left behind. And as the figure stepped into view, I saw my own face staring back at me once more. "Not yet," it said, "but soon." And with that, the darkness swallowed me whole. The loop continued. Have you ever looked at something you know you've never seen before, but felt like it's been there all along? It was a quiet evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had just returned from a long day at work, tired but ready to settle in for the night. The apartment was empty, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold night air. My phone buzzed in my hand, a notification from my food delivery app. It was a usual occurrence, something I did every few nights when I didn't feel like cooking. I unlocked the app, scrolled through the options, and opened my list of saved delivery addresses. I glanced over them without much thought: home, work, a couple of friends' places. But then my eyes stopped. There it was. A new address. My address. I blinked, then frowned. I knew it was my apartment because the street name and number were correct. But the strange thing was, I had never added this address. I only used the app when I was too tired or too busy to cook. I didn't even order from here, ever. I tapped on it, thinking it might be some glitch. But the app loaded the details. Everything looked normal. It was listed as a valid address, one that had been used recently. The option to remove it was there, so I hesitated for a moment. Maybe I had accidentally clicked something while ordering in the past. I couldn't remember. Curiosity nudged me to check the order history. I scrolled through the list of past deliveries, and again, something was off. The last order I had made was from a completely different street on the other side of town. There was no record of anything from my current address, at least not under my name. It was getting late, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A weird chill crept up my spine, one that had nothing to do with the draft in the apartment. I decided to close the app, thinking it was just a mistake. Maybe a bug in the system, nothing more. But as I set my phone down on the counter, I couldn't shake the thought of that address. I had never entered it. Yet, here it was, listed as if it belonged to me. Suddenly, the silence of the apartment felt oppressive. My heart began to race as the shadow of doubt grew in my mind. The address, my address, had no reason to be there. It was like someone had placed it there for me. Or maybe it was something more. I walked across the room, turning on the lights as I went. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in around me. I tried to shake off the feeling and walked to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. But as I filled the kettle, a sound from the hallway made me freeze, a soft tap, like a knock on the door. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and it was late. I glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. I stepped toward the door, my heart pounding now. No one was supposed to be here. I hadn't invited anyone over. The knocking stopped. But now, there was something else. A slight scraping sound, as if something, or someone, was moving just beyond the door. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the door. Nothing. Just the usual dark hallway outside. I stepped back inside, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had just imagined it. But the hairs on the back of my neck were still standing. I looked back at the app on my phone, the mysterious address still there. The sense of unease crept back, even though the apartment was silent again. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something I couldn't see or understand. I glanced at the clock again. I hadn't been expecting anyone. But then, why did I feel like I was waiting for something? Waiting for someone, or something, to show up? I shut off the phone screen and set it down. But as I did, the screen flickered for a moment and then flashed a new notification. The app had updated, listing the address once more. This time, it was different. Instead of my name, the list displayed someone else's. I stared at it. Someone I didn't know. A name I didn't recognize. And in that moment, it felt like I was no longer alone in my own apartment. The walls, the door, the silence, it all began to feel wrong. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my fingers frozen above the phone. The name on the address list wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. The name didn't even sound familiar, but it was clear as day on the screen, Jason Miller. For a split second, I wondered if it was just a mistake, another glitch. Maybe the app had malfunctioned, pulling someone else's information into my account. But as I stood there, holding the phone in trembling hands, The unease deepened. I couldn't remember ever hearing that name before, let alone associating it with my address. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing, just some random coincidence. But my stomach churned as I considered the possibility someone else had been here. The knocking from earlier. It wasn't a knock. It had been a faint sound, just a tap. But what if it had been something else? What if I had missed something? I walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. The hallway outside was still empty, nothing out of the ordinary. But something felt off, as if the space beyond that door was slowly growing more unfamiliar. I closed the door and locked it again, just to be sure. The apartment felt smaller now, more confined. The once comforting hum of the refrigerator seemed distant, muffled by an ever-present pressure in the air. Even the lights overhead flickered, though it was only a brief moment of disruption. A trick of the eye, I told myself. But it wasn't just the lights. It was the silence. The oppressive silence that filled the apartment, as if the walls were listening, waiting for something. I went back to my phone, trying to find any clue that would explain the name on the app. I scrolled through my past orders again, but this time I noticed something else. There were small, subtle differences in the details. The font. The way the addresses were displayed. Everything looked fine, but it didn't feel like my phone anymore. It felt altered. The realization hit me like a cold wave. What if my phone had somehow been tampered with? I opened my messages to check for anything that might explain the sudden appearance of Jason Miller. There were no messages from the app, no alerts, nothing that might hint at a mistake. My fingers hovered over the screen as I scrolled through the contact list. But something strange caught my eye. At the top of the list, there was a new contact, Jason Miller. No message history, no phone number, just the name, as if it had been placed there just for me to see. I felt my heart skip. My breath came faster now. This wasn't a coincidence. I had no recollection of ever seeing this name before, yet here it was, in my phone, in the app, and now, on my doorstep. I quickly dialed a friend, someone I trusted. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. The phone rang, but no answer. I tried again. Nothing. I left a message, but deep down, I knew it was pointless. The world outside felt so distant now, like it was slipping away, leaving me in a place that wasn't mine anymore. A sharp noise, like a tapping against glass, cut through my thoughts. I froze. It came from the window. I didn't want to look. I had to look. My body moved on its own, as if I was being pulled toward it. I approached the window, peering through the blinds. My heart was pounding in my chest. The city lights below were hazy, the streets empty. There was no one out there. Just the usual quiet city night. But as I stared out into the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing across the street. Tall, uncomfortably still. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew they were looking at me. I felt it. The weight of their gaze. My breath caught in my throat. Jason Miller. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I had to be imagining it. I had to be. But the tapping came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The noise was unmistakable, coming from the window. But no one was there. I turned and ran toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. Again, no sound, no sign of anyone. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of it. The hall was normal, nothing had changed. But I could feel it. Something was there, just out of sight, moving closer, circling me. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, shaking. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my legs felt heavy, unwilling to move. I checked my phone again, my hands shaking. The address was still there, Jason Miller's address. Still connected to my name. And that's when it happened. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. Everything went dark. The darkness enveloped me completely. My fingers fumbled for the light switch, but it was useless. The apartment had gone silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. My heart pounded in the heavy quiet, the weight of the dark pressing on me from all sides. I stood still, my senses straining, trying to make out any sound, any movement. My breath was shallow, my pulse quickened with every passing second. Then, from somewhere in the apartment, a faint noise reached my ears, footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. The sound was coming from behind me. My head jerked around, expecting to see someone standing in the dark. But there was nothing. The living room was empty, just the faint outline of furniture visible through the dim glow of the city lights outside, still obscured by the heavy curtains. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been alone too long. I turned toward the door again, still feeling an overwhelming urge to escape, but I hesitated. Something didn't feel right about opening it again. I didn't know what I was expecting. An answer? An explanation? I felt the strange sensation of being watched again, the oppressive feeling that wasn't just coming from the dark corners of the room, but from the very walls themselves. My hands trembled as I grabbed the phone from my pocket, the screen lighting up in my grip. Jason Miller. The name was still there, impossible to ignore. I opened the app once more, the glow from my phone the only source of light in the apartment. The address I had seen earlier, my own, was still listed, but now it looked different. The entry had changed, updated somehow. The time of delivery had shifted to a future date that made no sense. It was a few days from now. I scrolled through the details again, each one seeming more unreal than the last. How could this be? I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't even used the app in weeks. And yet, here it was, a future delivery, an address that wasn't mine, and the name of someone I didn't know. The tapping returned. This time, it was coming from the walls. Light, rapid, like fingernails scraping against the plaster, but there was no one there. I forced myself to stay calm, but my hands shook as I grabbed the door handle again, but stopped myself. I knew I couldn't open that door. Not again. The apartment felt smaller now, suffocating. The silence was maddening, broken only by the occasional creaks from the walls. Something was shifting, moving within the very space I thought I knew. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in my hand. I jumped, almost dropping it, before I looked at the screen. Delivery arriving soon. I froze. The message made no sense. I checked the time, almost midnight. How could a delivery be arriving now? My heart was racing as I stared at the screen, trying to piece together what was happening. And then, I heard it. A distinct sound from the hallway outside, soft but deliberate. The tap of shoes against the floor. But not just one pair, there were two. Two distinct sounds, getting closer. I backed away from the door, panic rising in my chest. I had to escape. But the phone buzzed again. This time, the message was more cryptic. It didn't have any text, just a picture. A picture of my apartment, the very one I was standing in, with someone's shadow cast in the doorway. I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't tell who it was, just the outline of a person standing in the doorway, waiting. And then the doorbell rang. I rushed to the peephole, almost knocking over a chair in my haste. The hallway outside was still empty, yet the bell had clearly rung. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a cold chill creeping over my skin. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. But I had to know. I moved cautiously toward the door, hands shaking as I reached for the knob again. The air felt thick, suffocating. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear any movement, any sound. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it again. The soft tap, tap, tap from the other side of the door, almost like fingers running across the wood. With a sudden burst of courage, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No one was there. I stepped out, scanning the empty corridor. The overhead lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The silence seemed to stretch for an eternity. And then I noticed something that sent my heart into a frenzy. The door to the apartment across the hall was open, just a crack. A sliver of darkness inside. I hadn't seen that door open before. The apartments were all supposed to be locked. I moved closer, my breath quick and shallow, as I reached out toward the door. My hand hovered just inches from the handle when a whisper, soft and faint, reached my ears. Jason Miller. I froze. The voice wasn't mine. It was coming from the darkness inside the apartment. And as I looked at the door, I realized there was no one there. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea what I had just heard, or if it was even real. My body felt cold, every inch of me trembling, yet the air in the hallway was heavy, suffocating. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. I turned and quickly retreated back into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the door, my mind reeling with the impossible situation I had found myself in. The sound of the whisper still lingered in my ears, soft, chilling, and unmistakable. Jason Miller. I couldn't shake the name. It was like a pulse beating in my skull. I didn't know anyone by that name, yet something about it felt familiar. As if I had heard it before, long ago. The apartment was silent again, but it felt wrong. Every corner seemed to be filled with unseen eyes, every shadow stretching unnaturally in the dim light. I forced myself to walk to the kitchen, hoping the routine would calm my nerves. But as I moved, I noticed the strangest thing. The kitchen was different. The layout hadn't changed, but the counter where I usually left my keys and phone was completely bare. Nothing was there. I walked over to it, my feet feeling heavy on the floor as if something was weighing me down. I reached out, but just before I could touch the surface, I noticed something on the floor. A slip of paper. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was a receipt. But not just any receipt. It was a food order receipt dated for 2 days ago. The same food delivery service I had never used before. The receipt listed the exact items I had once ordered years ago at a restaurant that had long since closed down. I stared at it, my mind refusing to connect the dots. How had it gotten here? Why was it in my apartment? And most importantly, why had I never ordered from here? Suddenly, the lights flickered above me. A soft hum filled the room as the bulb flickered twice more before going out completely, plunging the kitchen into darkness. I was about to reach for my phone to turn on the flashlight when I felt it, a presence behind me. Cold, like a gust of wind, but heavier. More solid. It felt like something was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't dare turn around. The silence was unbearable. My breathing felt too loud. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, thumping erratically. And then, as if to confirm my fear, the sound came again, the faint tap, tap, tap of footsteps, as if someone was walking across the wooden floors. I swallowed hard, my body paralyzed. The footsteps grew closer. They were slow, deliberate, as if they were taking their time. Jason Miller. The voice came again. But this time, it was different. It was close, too close. I turned quickly, panic rising like a tidal wave, but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty. But the air was colder now. And the door to the hallway, which I had shut moments ago, was ajar again, just a crack. I didn't know how it happened. I didn't want to know. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, quickly swiping it open. The glow of the screen illuminated my face in the darkness, and for a moment it felt like I was looking at a stranger in the reflection. I opened the delivery app once again, hoping that there would be some explanation, anything that would make sense of this madness. My eyes skimmed the list of orders, still perplexed by the name that had shown up. Jason Miller. The app refreshed. And there it was. A new message. Your order is being processed. I looked at the screen, my stomach churning. I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't done anything. But the message was clear. And the address was my own. I backed away from the kitchen counter, my mind spiraling, trying to grasp at any sense of reality. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. Suddenly, I heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the walls again, that same odd tapping, like fingers brushing against the surface. But this time, it was louder, closer. And then, something changed. The scratching stopped. There was a stillness in the air, an eerie calm that settled like a heavy fog. It was then that I noticed the door to the living room, which had been shut earlier, was now wide open. The hallway lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My eyes darted between the open door and the screen of my phone, still showing the impossible message. And then, through the open doorway, I saw it. A figure. A shadow, standing just beyond the threshold, barely visible in the dim light. But it wasn't just a shadow. It had shape, depth, presence. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its form seemed to twist and shift as if it were made of smoke, stretching and warping with every passing second. I could feel my heart race, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The figure stood motionless, staring at me. The whisper came again. This time louder, clearer. Jason Miller. The words echoed in my mind, sending a wave of dread through me. I knew, without a doubt, that it was speaking to me. But how could it know my name? I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred. The figure took a step forward, its presence growing more oppressive with each movement. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt like the walls of my apartment were closing in on me, suffocating me with their weight. And then, the lights went out completely. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. But there was no escaping the darkness now. I don't know how long I stood there in the suffocating dark. Time seemed to stretch, as if the very seconds had become thick, heavy, and impossible to count. The figure was still there, its presence overwhelming, like a storm gathering just outside my reach. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm erratic and frantic. My breath, shallow and quick, trembled in the silence. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, the air growing denser with every passing second. Then, a sound broke through the stillness, the sound of a door creaking open. I didn't dare move, my feet glued to the floor, as if the very act of stepping might awaken something far worse. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of logic in the chaos that surrounded me. How could this be happening? How could my own apartment, my own home, feel like a trap? The figure moved closer, but the footsteps weren't the same as before. The tapping had stopped. Now, there was only a faint scrape of something sliding along the floor. I strained my ears, the darkness making everything seem louder, more pronounced. The scrape turned into a slow, deliberate drag, like fingers trailing across the floorboards. But this time, it wasn't coming from the doorway. It was coming from the walls. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. The soft, unnatural sound of something or someone pressing against the walls, shifting inside them. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the impossible truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to the space of the apartment. It was inside the walls, moving just out of sight, just beyond my reach. Jason Miller, the whisper came again, but now it was not just a whisper. It was a hiss, something that scraped across my nerves like fingernails on glass. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even think. The name felt like an anchor, a weight pulling me deeper into the darkness. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted in place, frozen by the terror creeping through the room. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, the door to the living room swung open fully, as though it were being pushed from the other side by an unseen hand. The hallway light flickered once more, and the shadows twisted as if alive, distorting the room in impossible shapes. My mind could no longer tell where the shadows ended and the darkness began. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around me. I thought I saw something in the doorway, movement. A silhouette standing just at the edge of the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. I strained my eyes, focusing on the spot where I thought I'd seen the figure. The air was still, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. It was like 1,000 unseen eyes were fixed on me, waiting for something. Then, without warning, the light in the hallway flashed, blindingly bright. I squinted, my hand instinctively lifting to shield my eyes. When the light dimmed, everything had changed. The hallway was no longer empty. The figure stood there, no longer just a shadow, but a full, tangible form. It was tall, too tall. Its body seemed to shimmer, like it was made of smoke or mist, with shapes shifting and distorting across its surface. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stared, paralyzed by the sight of it. It was standing in the doorway, blocking the exit to the rest of the apartment. It had no face, just a blank, smooth surface where one should be. Its hands were unnaturally long, elongated fingers hanging at its sides like skeletal claws. And then, in that stillness, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't a hiss. It was clear. Direct. Jason Miller, it said, and I felt the weight of the name settle over me like a stone. I swallowed, finally able to speak, but my voice trembled with fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements smooth and calculated, like it knew exactly where to go and what to do. It didn't make a sound as it crossed the threshold. Suddenly, the air in the room thickened, and I felt as though I were drowning in it. The walls seemed to close in around me, the ceiling lowering, the floor becoming unstable beneath my feet. The very space of the apartment felt alive, breathing with some unnatural force. I wanted to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows across the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure lunged toward me. But it wasn't a physical lunge. It was as though it moved through the space, slipping between the cracks of reality. In the blink of an eye, it was standing right in front of me, its formless face now inches away from mine. Its hands reached out, impossibly long fingers brushing my skin. "Jason Miller," it whispered again, but this time the voice was mine. And in that moment, I understood. I had always been Jason Miller. The apartment, the delivery app, the strange name, it was all part of the same puzzle. The figure, the voice, the message, it had all been leading up to this. I wasn't just trapped in the apartment. I was trapped in myself. The last thing I remember was the cold, the pressure, and the sensation of slipping into a place where nothing made sense. Where the apartment had no address, and I no longer knew who I was. And then, everything went dark. The silence in the apartment remained. Have you ever had the feeling that time slipped away from you? That something happened, but you can't quite put your finger on it? You remember everything perfectly, yet the clock shows something different, something that shouldn't be possible. I woke up with a start. The room was still dark, but there was a strange light creeping through the curtains. It felt wrong. A low, strange hum seemed to buzz around the room, almost as if the walls themselves were vibrating. I glanced at the clock. It was 6 a.m. I had set my alarm for 7. It was supposed to be a normal day. But my eyes lingered on the calendar next to the bed. My heart skipped. The date was wrong. It wasn't the date I remembered going to sleep on. I knew, with absolute certainty, that yesterday had been the 3rd of the month. I had even looked at the calendar before going to bed. I had a meeting at work, something important. I had to be prepared. But now, as I stared at the calendar, it read the 5th. How could this be? My mind raced, trying to piece together the missing time. The events of yesterday, of last night, felt blurry, like I was trying to recall a dream. But I knew for sure that I had gone to sleep on the 3rd. I hadn't I? A chill ran down my spine. The house felt different now, quieter. There was no sound of the morning birds outside, no hum of traffic from the nearby street. The silence felt too thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up, still dizzy from the thought that the day had disappeared. My feet sank into the cold wooden floor, and I walked towards the calendar. Maybe I was just mistaken. Maybe I had somehow confused the dates. But the more I stared at the page, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I reached out and traced the number 5 with my finger. I expected it to feel like paper, but instead it felt strange, slightly wet, almost like rubber. My breath caught. I quickly pulled my hand away, blinking in confusion. I stared at the calendar for a long time, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come. My mind raced, jumping to different possibilities. Could it be a mistake? Maybe I was sleepwalking? Maybe I was still dreaming. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The clock on the nightstand clicked, and the sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned and glanced at it. The time hadn't changed. It was still 6 a.m. But I couldn't help but feel that the world around me had shifted while I was asleep, that time had been stolen from me without me even noticing. The soft hum in the air intensified, almost like it was getting closer. It was more than just the usual morning quiet. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was pressing against me. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, as I turned to leave the room, a sudden noise broke through the silence. A knock. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was there, unmistakable. The knock was coming from the front door. I froze again. No one had come to visit. No one had planned to visit. I hadn't even heard anyone on the street. How could someone be at my door? I tried to push the feeling down. Maybe it was just a neighbor, maybe someone had made a mistake, or it was just some random person knocking. But the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. My pulse quickened, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Something wasn't right. Something was off. I turned toward the door. The hum in the air was louder now, buzzing in my ears. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet shuffling across the floor. I couldn't bring myself to open the door immediately. Instead, I walked slowly towards it, my mind clouded with questions. Who was at my door? Why had they knocked so early? What was going on with the date? When I reached the door, I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, frozen. The knock came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. I opened the door quickly, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the same empty hallway, quiet and still, with no sign of anyone nearby. I stepped into the hallway, looking up and down. The building was silent, too quiet. No footsteps, no sounds of life. It felt wrong. I turned back to look at my apartment, the door still wide open. But as I stepped inside, I realized something else, something I hadn't noticed before. My living room looked different. The furniture had been shifted. The couch was in a different position. The rug was gone. The walls were covered with something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I backed away, feeling dizzy. This couldn't be happening. I had only been gone for a few seconds. How could everything look so different? The hum in the air grew louder, and for a brief moment, the world around me seemed to tremble. I needed to understand what was going on. I needed to figure out what happened to the day I had lost. But as I turned to look for answers, I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had known had changed. And I wasn't sure if I was the one who had missed something, or if time itself had slipped away from me, taking me somewhere I didn't belong. The door slammed shut behind me. And just as quickly, I heard another knock. I stood frozen, my body tense, my breath shallow. The knock echoed again through the apartment, vibrating against the walls. It was louder now, almost demanding. I turned slowly, still unable to process what was happening. My apartment, my home, looked wrong. The furniture was no longer where I had left it. The familiar surroundings now felt foreign, strange, as though I had walked into someone else's life. I hesitated before stepping further into the living room, my eyes scanning every inch for something familiar. The hum from before had stopped, but now there was an eerie stillness that felt even more unnerving. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the disorienting scene before me. Had I been sleepwalking? Was I hallucinating? But no, I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. The day on the calendar, the knocking at the door, it was all real. But it didn't add up. I moved cautiously toward the door, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something or someone behind me. I couldn't explain why, but I felt as if I wasn't alone. When I opened the door again, the hallway outside was empty, just like before. I looked both ways, my eyes scanning the darkened corners of the building. There was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no voices. Just silence. I stepped back inside, my heart hammering. The sound of my own pulse seemed deafening in the quiet apartment. I glanced around once more, feeling a rising panic that I couldn't shake. My eyes kept darting to the calendar on the wall. The 5th. I couldn't understand it. How could I have missed an entire day? What had happened while I slept? The more I thought about it, the more my mind seemed to unravel. I couldn't trust anything anymore, not the calendar, not the knocking, not even the walls around me. Everything felt like it was slipping away. A sound broke the silence again, a soft tapping, almost like a finger brushing against glass. It was coming from the other room. My legs moved instinctively, my feet moving faster than my mind. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find the source of the sound, or if I was just desperate to see something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare. The tapping continued, rhythmic and soft, like something, or someone, was waiting for me. I reached the doorway to the kitchen, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was different now too. The countertops, the sink, the appliances, all of them were slightly out of place. They weren't where I remembered them. But what chilled me more than the rearranged furniture was the subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. It was colder here, and the silence was so thick, it felt suffocating. I looked toward the corner where I usually kept a small potted plant. It wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a small, dark stain on the floor, a deep, inky blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it made my stomach turn. I took a hesitant step forward, unable to tear my eyes away. The stain didn't look like anything I had ever seen. It wasn't a spill or dirt, it was something darker, something that seemed out of place in the clean, well-kept kitchen. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A cold shiver ran through me, and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, someone who had been hiding just out of sight, watching me. But there was no one. No one except for the faint sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven in the silence. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. The more I thought about it, the more my mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of it all. Had I lost time? Or had time simply forgotten me? I needed answers. I couldn't just sit here, letting everything slip away without knowing what was happening to me. But the more I searched, the more I realized that the answers weren't coming. They weren't in the furniture, or the stain on the floor, or the strange knock at the door. They were somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond what I could see. I turned back toward the hallway, my mind racing with questions. Could this all be in my head? Was I losing my grip on reality? But even as I wondered, a creeping suspicion began to grow in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't alone in this apartment. And whatever was here with me, whatever was manipulating time and space, wasn't going to let me go easily. I moved toward the door again, hoping to escape, but the moment I touched the handle, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was inside my apartment. It was coming from the walls. I spun around, looking desperately for the source. The walls, they were alive, pulsing with the sound, as though something was trying to break through. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my spine. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, like something, or someone, was desperate to get out. And then the door behind me slammed shut. I stood there in shock, my mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. The door I had just opened, the one I had been so sure was free to leave through, had slammed shut with an unnerving finality. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling as I pressed against the wood. The surface felt wrong, too solid, as though the very door itself had transformed into something else, something more than just a barrier between rooms. The knocking from the walls didn't stop. It intensified. A deep, hollow thud echoed from behind the plaster, followed by an eerie scraping sound, as if claws were dragging along the insides of the walls. My heart thudded in my chest as the sound reverberated through every inch of the apartment. The noise was overwhelming, growing louder, pulsing, as though it was coming from every direction at once. I couldn't breathe. I backed away from the door, my feet slipping on the cold floor. There was no escape. No way out. The apartment, once a familiar space, had turned into a prison, each sound a reminder that something was closing in on me, something I couldn't see but could feel in the air around me. The silence that had taken over the hallway was replaced by the incessant knocks, rattling the windows now, causing the glass to shake. I had to do something, but what? My mind, clouded by panic, raced from one thought to another, none of them making any sense. I stumbled into the living room, my eyes darting to the calendar again. The 5th still stared back at me, mocking me. But I couldn't remember how I got here. How had I moved from my bedroom to this point? What had happened between when I fell asleep and when I woke up? And the knocking, it was coming closer. It was no longer distant. It wasn't the walls anymore. It was the floor, the ceiling, the air itself. I could feel the vibrations under my feet, like something was trying to break through the apartment from all sides. I had to act. I rushed to the window and looked outside, but the street was empty. There was no one in sight, no sign of life. Everything was wrong, silent, too still. The world felt like it had been suspended, frozen in time. How could this be happening? Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I jumped. I hadn't noticed it until now. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow in the otherwise dark room. I grabbed it, my hand shaking, and saw a message. "Are you okay? You didn't answer last night. I've been trying to reach you." It was from Julia, my best friend. But the message didn't make sense. I didn't remember speaking to Julia last night. I hadn't even checked my phone. What was she talking about? I typed a quick response, trying to calm my nerves. "What do you mean? What happened last night?" I waited. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. I stared at the screen, but there was no reply. The knocking grew louder, if that was even possible. It was everywhere now. I couldn't think straight. I ran to the bathroom, hoping to find some sense of normalcy in the reflection of my own face. But as I looked into the mirror, I froze. My reflection didn't match my movements. I blinked, stepping closer to the mirror. The image of me in the reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. It stayed still, almost frozen. But as I stared, I saw my reflection's eyes flicker. No, they didn't flicker. They shifted, moving as if looking at something just over my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the suffocating silence that filled the room. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection was gone. I stumbled back, my breath coming faster. I didn't know what was happening anymore. My heart raced, and I could hear it pounding in my ears. Was I losing my mind? Was this a dream, or was I trapped in some distorted version of my life? The phone buzzed again. A new message from Julia. I don't know how to explain it, but I think you need to leave. The place you're at, it's not right. I didn't have time to think. I needed to get out. I needed to get away from this apartment, from the overwhelming sense of something closing in around me. I ran toward the front door, pulling at the handle, desperate to escape. But the door wouldn't open. I tugged harder, panic rising in my chest. I tried again, slamming my shoulder against it, but it refused to budge. The walls seemed to press closer, the air thick with an unnatural pressure, as if the room itself was pushing me back. The knocking came again. It wasn't just in the walls this time. It was in the door. It was as though something was knocking from the other side of it, desperate to get in. I could feel the vibrations through the wood, shaking my bones with its intensity. I fell to the floor, feeling a cold sweat cover my skin. My mind raced, spinning faster and faster, unable to grasp onto any reality I once knew. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The door splintered open, and I was thrown backward by the force. A shadow stood in the doorway, blocking the light from the hallway. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It wasn't human. It was something else. And it was waiting for me. The shadow in the doorway stood motionless. I could feel its presence, heavy, suffocating, as though it was pulling the very air from my lungs. My body refused to obey me. My legs were frozen to the floor, and my hands were clammy, barely able to grasp the edges of the nearby coffee table for support. The room around me seemed to narrow, as if the walls were closing in. I couldn't look away from the doorway. My eyes were glued to the figure, and yet I couldn't make out any distinct features. It wasn't fully formed, just a dark, shifting mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. The knocking had stopped. In its place, there was a sound that was much worse, a low, resonant hum, like the rumble of distant thunder, but far too close. It vibrated through my chest, shaking my bones. The air in the room felt thick with an oppressive force, as though something was about to break free from the dark figure in the doorway. It took a step forward. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by fear. It took another step, its silhouette growing more defined with each passing second. I felt a coldness seep into the room, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My skin prickled, goosebumps crawling across my arms as I instinctively shrank back. The figure was closer now, closer than any rational thought would allow. And then, its eyes. They weren't like eyes at all. They were deep, endless voids. Black holes that seemed to swallow everything around them, sucking in the dim light of the apartment and turning it into something darker. I felt myself being drawn into them, as if I was losing all sense of time, of place. The clock on the wall, when I last checked it. The numbers blurred in front of me, stretching and twisting unnaturally, as if the very concept of time was being erased. I couldn't look away. The pull was too strong. It was as though something was calling to me from within those black depths, something ancient and unknowable. I had to break free. I had to escape. The room seemed to distort. The walls that once stood firm now seemed to warp, breathing in time with the ominous hum that vibrated through the floor. The apartment I had known, the apartment I had thought was mine, was no longer familiar. It felt like a dream, like something impossible. This wasn't my home. This wasn't even real. I tried to move. I dragged my feet, trying to reach the door behind me. But it wasn't the door anymore. It had transformed, the wooden frame melting into something wrong. The door now had jagged edges, like teeth. The walls were pulsating, like the apartment itself was alive and breathing with an insidious intent. My mind raced. Was this a nightmare? Was I hallucinating? Or was I trapped in some twisted version of reality? I couldn't tell anymore. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, I heard it, soft footsteps. Light at first, barely perceptible. The figure was moving toward me. I stumbled back, but my legs couldn't hold me. I hit the floor with a thud, my vision blurring as panic set in. The footsteps grew louder, each one like the beating of a drum in my skull. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was all too much. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped. I was on the floor, gasping for air, my mind overwhelmed with terror. I turned my head to look up, but there was no figure. The doorway was empty. The apartment, strangely still, seemed to have returned to normal, or at least, as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. But I couldn't trust my senses. The space felt different now, warped. It wasn't just the apartment. The whole world felt like it was slipping away, like the threads of reality were unraveling right in front of me. I stood, shakily, my hands bracing against the wall for support. I looked back at the calendar, still stuck on the 5th. Something wasn't right. I had to leave. But I wasn't sure where to go. As I moved toward the door once more, I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, like a whisper just out of reach. You're not supposed to be here. I froze, my heart stuttering in my chest. The voice came from all around me, echoing through the walls, vibrating in the air itself. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to face whatever this was. But I did. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't the apartment that had changed. It was me. Something had happened, something I couldn't comprehend, and now I was part of whatever this was. I had become a part of the darkness, of the distortion, and there was no going back. I reached for the door again. My fingers brushed the handle, and I felt it, the same cold, unyielding sensation I had felt when the shadow first appeared. The door was no longer an escape. It was another trap. I pulled my hand away. And then, I saw it. The date on the calendar. It had changed. It was no longer the 5th. It was the 6th. But it was still too early. And the knocking, it was still there. Still coming. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the calendar. The 6th. It was impossible. The date had changed, but the knocking was still there, growing louder, as though it was coming from within the walls themselves. The apartment felt wrong, diseased, as if something invisible was lurking in every corner, watching and waiting. I turned away from the calendar, my breath shallow. I had to leave. But where could I go? Every part of me screamed to escape, to find some semblance of safety, but deep down, I knew it was pointless. There was nowhere left to run. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. My pulse raced, my body trembling as the walls seemed to tighten around me. I moved towards the door, hand shaking as I grasped the handle again. The cold seeped through my fingertips, and I recoiled, feeling the chill crawl up my arm. I glanced back at the apartment, the room shifting in front of my eyes. The furniture was no longer familiar, the objects seemed to twist, their shapes becoming distorted, like reflections in a cracked mirror. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges louder than it should have been, stretching out the tension. The hallway outside was dark, far darker than it should have been. The dim light from my apartment barely made a dent in the suffocating blackness. The knocking had stopped. But the silence, it felt worse. It felt like something was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The air here was thick, almost oppressive, as if the space itself was pressing down on me. I looked left, then right, but there was no sign of anyone. No one in sight. No sounds. I forced my legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the floor beneath me had turned to quicksand. I glanced at the walls, expecting to see shadows creeping along them. But there was nothing. The hallway was too still, too silent. I reached the stairs. They seemed to stretch on forever, descending into darkness, like an abyss that would swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. My breathing quickened, and I froze, suddenly unsure if I should continue. My eyes darted to the door I had just come from, my safe place, if it even was that anymore. The apartment seemed so far away now, but something deep within me whispered that I couldn't go back, that I wouldn't be able to escape if I did. I turned away from the stairs, my legs unsteady beneath me. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere, just to escape the suffocating sense of wrongness that hung in the air. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and the apartment as possible. I turned the corner into another hallway, this one far narrower, as though the building itself was becoming more claustrophobic. The hallway stretched out endlessly, just like the stairs, but the walls on either side were covered in dark stains. The smell of mildew, something bitter and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered my mouth with the sleeve of my jacket, but the smell clung to the air, suffocating even as I hurried forward. Something wasn't right. The hallway was supposed to end. There should have been a door, or at least another set of stairs. But instead, the walls seemed to curve inward, as though the entire building was bending to trap me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I could see it. The door at the end of the hallway. It was wrong. Too dark, the shadows around it far too deep. It wasn't there before. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, drawn to the door despite every fiber of my being telling me not to. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. The door creaked open by itself as I reached it, the sound of the hinges grating against the silence. My breath caught in my throat, and my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. A cold draft swept through the hallway, pushing me forward, and I finally stepped inside. The room was small, its walls lined with bookshelves that looked like they had been there for centuries. The air was stale, thick with dust. But it wasn't the room that stopped me, it was what was in it. The calendar. It was hanging on the wall. The date read the 5th, but it was the 6th. I stared at the calendar, feeling my breath catch in my throat. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. I had seen it change. I had watched the numbers flip in front of my eyes. And now this? The day before, the date I had lived through, was staring me in the face like some cruel joke. The knocking started again, faint but growing, echoing from all sides, pounding in my skull. My pulse raced, my vision blurring. The room spun, and I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the door. But when I looked, the door was gone. The hallway outside had disappeared. I was trapped in this place. Trapped in this endless cycle of time, this endless loop of days that no longer made sense. I reached for my phone, desperate for something, anything, to give me a sense of normality. But when I checked the time, my blood ran cold. It was the 5th again. The same day. I had woken up in the same day, the same time, over and over. And the knocking, it was getting closer. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.